Who's pumped for tax season? Let's get out there and crush those taxes. Who's with me?
We know some freelancers who are pumped for tax season. This year, hire a tax expert on Fiverr.
Done.
So you think you know Wix, but do you really? First up, we've got shape video masks. You can use different shapes to create completely different vibes and aesthetics. Or you can create your own graphic. I use the shape composition here. Just import any SVG file and set it as a shape mask. Nice. Next up, we'll keep it moving with the hover box. You can use it to animate any element and create these really eye-catching interactions. And what I love is that the level of control you get here is crazy precise. You can set your animation ease, scale size, and position to create this really dope effect. Third, we've got the mega menu. This not only lets you organize your site menu into different subcategories, but it also looks amazing when you add in different elements like text, buttons, images, and pretty much anything you can think of. And last but not least, we've got My Designs. This feature lets you save any section or component that you've already created, and you can use it as a starting point on any other pages or sites you're working on. This one's personally saved me a ton of time. So you got all these features. Now see what you can do with them. Get on over to Wix and create something dope.
All right. Here we go. We're just gonna watch some videos and play some.
This is Dave, head of marketing at a ketchup company, about to use Grammarly to handle it.
Your TikTok with Mr. Beat about liberals being good is an unhinged mess. What do you think is unhinged? Liberals are awesome. They're better than whatever the you think. Das Nak, tell me. Communism and socialism are both economic models, not political ideologies. I love Destiny, but he fumbled a bit here.
I've never played as these guys. Damn, they seem evil looking, though.
Okay. On communism,
like
you're absolutely wrong. On socialism, you're, in effect, almost completely wrong. To say that socialism is only an economic model and doesn't apply any sort of political organization, like, even capitalism implies some level of political organization.
Yeah, but socialism definitely does.
For instance, it would be hard for me to imagine, like, a monarch with a capitalist government or a capitalist economy. A real monarch, not like a play monarch like in the UK. Or actually, even if anything, that supports my point, right? Like, or it'd be hard to imagine like an authoritarian dictatorship. Unless the capitalist was literally just like the state, I guess. Like in China's case, you can argue China's like a state capitalist country.
Yeah.
But communism and socialism generally imply
Thank
things.
you. I know, I'm pretty sexy.
Relating to political organization as well. But also, they suck economically anyways. Wait, so what do actually, but even if we just talk about it economically, they suck. So, hold on. People say cut a liberal and a fascist, please.
Hotty patati.
Okay. We did. The communists or the socialists, all these motherfuckers wanted to make alliances with the Nazis. True, they did. With Molotov, Ribbentrop, whatever. They did it, and then afterwards, a lot of these fucking lefties will point out like, oh, what about Operation Paperclip, where we took all the Nazis and we brought some literal scientists to capture their knowledge and everything. But also,
the Soviet Union took way more.
They took more than us. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's like Kim or whatever. This operation, they took over 2,000 of those German scientists, and they took them into their country. So the idea that the United States was alone in this, taking something, like, you have to take the researchers, otherwise I'll go to the other team. I mean, like,
I wonder how this
steal
their information. Team works.
Steal their information.
Yeah, but I mean that's basically what we did by bringing them over, right? Well, bro doesn't know much about history. What did I say that was wrong? This is the most baseline knowledge, historical take I've ever had. That this was hearing. Okay, what was wrong? Destiny never heard of Gladio. Nope. Operation Gladio.
I've never heard of this.
Clandestine stay-behind operations of armed resistance that were organized by the Western Union, founded in 1948, secondly by NATO and by the CIA, in collaboration with the Western Union, also the Brussels Treaty Organization.
Chaos or die? What the fuck?
To the Italian branch of the NATO state-behind the use of assassination, psychological warfare, and false flag operations to delegitimize left-wing parties in Western European countries. What does that have to do with anything I said?
Ooh, gotta go get that.
It's so clear why Destiny talks to people who know nothing. I like how this criticism is always levied at me, and then when I finally end up talking to your favorite content creator online, we realize that he's actually a fucking moron. He thinks the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was actually real? Okay. We turned a boat of Jews around.
Oh, yeah, damn.
Cut a liberal and a fascist bleeds is a great saying and oh so accurate. Thank you. How are these people in my fucking... We need to do more... We need to do more liberal stuff, okay?
Fuck
what are these lefties doing on my fucking TikTok? All right, not good. You should ask TikTok for debates. Yeah. TikTok is like 90% lefties. Parts of it, but there's also parts of TikTok that are like hardcore and far right crazy too.
This Destiny guy has to be a psyop. There's like literally no other explanation. without fail, every time Hassan does anything, he, like, literally this was within 2 minutes. He responds. It's crazy. He's like, oh, I don't cover the breaking news, when Hassan was like, doing stuff about Gaza, right?
Like what's your point, Destiny? Actually, Hassan has said he doesn't cover breaking news.
He really does just like consume all of your thoughts. It's so fun. It's so weird. It's so weird. This is every Destiny fan. They'll like literally watch a hospital get bombed and be like, I'm not sure if that was actually true or not. I'll need a source for that. I'm like, this is a psyop. It has to be. He's like designed. He's the centrist.
Is this guy right wing or is he left wing?
Dude, do you know how quick this kind
Oh
of thing
no, he was
happens?
talking about Hassan,
It's like,
so
we
he's
don't have
definitely
time to,
left
like,
wing.
He's a plant. He has to be.
I'm opening a restaurant.
I still love the name.
You don't remember the name.
Of course I remember the name.
We didn't even tell anybody.
You scared me.
We don't have time to.
Why are you looking
the
at
thing
me
is,
like
we do
that?
have time. You're a streamer. You sit here and do nothing. It's not going to change
I
if you
know,
wait a
but
day
you're
or two.
staring at me like you're mad.
Why was I linked this? This is so stupid. This has to be a psyop. My psyop is I feel like I'm getting psyop by a psyop. All right. The devil donated $20. Your sympathy for Ethan of age 3 has led us to your videos. We were also disappointed at the pause on leftovers, as we wish to see a continued oppositional examination of the Gaza/Israeli conflict. Yeah, that's hard for Ethan. If you were a fan base, here's what I will say, okay? Oh, and I can say this, I'm a content creator. If you're a fan of Ethan, if they have an email thing, or if they've got like Twitter DMs open, like sending a message and saying like, hey, I understand that like it's really rough to talk about this and a lot of people are on you, but like I appreciate your perspective, or even if like I'm pro-Palestine or whatever, but like I understand where you're coming from, I know this much probably means a lot to them right now, because I'm sure that they're like super minded. This is probably some of the, if I had to guess in the history of H3H3, this is probably the most amount of public hate I think they've ever gotten. Do you think, have they ever, I'm trying to think, has Ethan ever been on this unpopular of a side of like woke scolds before or anything like that? Has he? I followed their stuff for like quite a while. I'm trying to think. I know he's been in like some controversial stuff before, but like of this, I don't think so. I wish Destiny would let out his biases. If he has, and I missed them, then all good, but he talks as if he has none, but some topics he approaches with some initial biases from my observation. I'm pretty sure I just tell you. Don't I tell you when I have like, oh, this is what I think about this so far? This is like, I'm pretty sure I've stated that almost everything. Like there's very few topics that I know absolutely nothing about, right? So I'm probably going into almost everything with somewhat of a bias. I'm pretty sure for the Israel-Palestine thing, I went in with a slight, I feel like I've had a Palestinian bias, but as I've read more and more over time, I start to lean a little bit more Israel. Now that I've done way more history reading, now I'm starting to really lean towards Israel. But again, that might change by the time we finish. We'll see. Okay. What is this? This was posted in the H3H3 subreddit. I know that Destiny and Hasanabi heads don't overlap because it's something that happened around or before 2018. I'm actually a longtime viewer of both Hassan and H3, and I'm not really sure what happened. Just that it spawned the what a fucking liar dude, what a fucking Weasley little liar meme. I'm honestly in full support of pausing leftovers literally because Destiny's YouTube page is just filled to the brim of shit on both Hassan and Ethan. I understand if you find that takes problematic, but the manner in which Destiny does all of that is so gross, I guess. Clips of him show up on my Insta feed all the time, and he seems to have reasonable takes most of the time. I just hate that Leftovers alone is supplying ammunition to that guy. The Venn diagram comparing leftists who hate Hassan and Ethan and Destiny fans is a circle. I am the boogeyman, true. It's not complicated. Oh boy.
I'm
So it's,
gonna
not a
speed this up.
so it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States.
Talking
It
about
acts on another
Israel?
population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship.
I mean, yeah,
Never
they aren't
held
ever held
anything
accountable for anything,
compared
I
to
feel like.
every other theocratic regime in that part of the world. Wait, hold on. Potentially super ignorant question. I think I asked this videos ago. Are there any other democratic regimes that do like voting and everything, like even remotely democratically, like in the Middle East? I think Iraq might now, right? Don't they? Or I can just Google this. Democracies in the Middle East. These countries with constitutional monarchies are generally considered democratic. For example, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, and Bahrain are considered constitutional monarchies. So does this mean like the king of Jordan just doesn't have much power, or?
Period. And just as like a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population
I
of
guess
Jewish
it
refugees
kind of
ended up in
depends
West
on what
Bank and
the
Gaza,
Constitution
and Arabic government in Jerusalem
says,
had
if
opened their
it would be
prison in what Jewish Gaza,
a democracy.
which they bombed with white phosphorus, they killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no
Indiscriminately?
provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate, life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic-Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods, they terrorized them with rocks, the security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was. So there's nothing complex about it. The second part of your question, it's a pure asymmetry relationship. And the question is rights or not. So that's it. It's not complicated. So it's
Okay.
The Butterfly Kiss Pro by Skull Shaver is one of the quickest and smoothest shaves you can find. 2 minutes and done. The blades of the Butterfly Kiss pivot and adjust. Get the Butterfly Kiss Pro by Skull Shaver now.
Where the fuck did this guy come from? I don't feel like fighting
the president with this
battle, even though.
Hey team. No. Hi team. I'm Sunny delighted to share
Is that
our
picture of someone getting
dazzling new company
crucified?
values.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel where we are unpacking and deconstructing all of the things that they taught us to believe growing up in fundamentalist, evangelical, and conservative Christian churches. If you don't already know, my name is Christy, and today I want to deconstruct the 10 Commandments, which just seems like something we should do, right? We should be looking at the 10 Commandments since the Christians love to kind of prop them up as the ultimate moral authority, you know, the list of rules that if you live by them, you will live a perfect and moral life. I think we should be talking about it because, you know, they want to put these up in courthouses and in classrooms and in their churches, and they want to preach them. They want us to live by them. But is the 10 Commandments really the most perfect law that we could follow?
Yes.
Could God have done better? Is that the best he could have done? And so I want to approach that today and see what you think. Let's go down the list. Let's approach each commandment and let's kind of figure this out. Let's see if the 10 Commandments really hold up to this portrait of a perfect moral system that the Christians paint them out to be. Now, just to let you guys know, my mic stand broke right before I got to recording this video, so I am having to hold this clunky thing, and you might hear it kind of moving around. I'm going to try to be careful. I tend to talk with my hands a lot, so that's going to be a little bit of a challenge, but just bear with me. I really appreciate it. Don't forget, I have a merch shop, jezebelvibes.com/shop. I'll link it in the description. You can check out my new Evidence for God shirt that I created to celebrate Ray Comfort responding to one of my videos. That was a really big moment for me. And so if you want to go and celebrate that with me or buy one of my other shirts and support me, I'll put the link in the description. I'm also on TikTok at Christy.Berg. So let's get into it. Let's read through the 10 Commandments and let's talk about it. So it's important to note that the 10 Commandments show up in both Deuteronomy and Exodus, and there are also 2 versions of the 10 Commandments that do not match up with one another at all. We're not going to get into that today. I want to address the 10 Commandments that Christians put up in their courthouses, because that's really the important part we need to be addressing. So we're going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 5, starting in verse 5. And Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us, not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face in the mountain out of the midst of the fire, while I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire. You did not go to the mountain. This is what he said." So here are your commandments. Verse 6, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So he's got to start this by reminding them, hey, I'm God. I brought you out of slavery. Yeah, sure, I allowed you to become enslaved in the first place, but I brought you out of it after a really long time, so you should be grateful and you should follow all of my commands. Verse 7, you shall have...
That's not what fucking happened, so...
no other gods before me. So this is the first of the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. I think it's very interesting how this is worded, because I do believe at that time, Israelites may have believed that other gods did exist, or there were other gods that were worshipped by other people. They acknowledged these other gods, and it's clear to see. It doesn't say, I am the one and only God, worship me, or you shall not worship all of those fake other gods. It says, you shall have no other gods before me. So this kind of implies that there are other gods out there. Who are these other gods is what I want to know. The first and most important commandment that God gives to his people is...
If you read the rest of the Bible, it doesn't imply that there are other gods.
Do not worship anyone else. The most important thing that you need to know is that I must be worshipped, because I am so great and I am your God and I created you and I brought you out of slavery. And so you must obey me, and you cannot obey anybody else. I'm the only one. I'm jealous.
You should obey
I think that there are probably other rules that could have gone in that number 1 spot. Maybe treat all people with compassion and kindness. That would have been a really good first rule. But, God is a little more concerned with your focus on him than he is concerned with your focus on other people. And if we keep reading, we'll see that. So the first verse, or the first commandment, no other gods before me. All right. Second one, you shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Whoo! I always just heard that it was don't carve an idol, but this is so much more loaded. You shall not make a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So,
one sec. Let me look this up. Let me look in my Bible. Last time I did this, when someone was doing this, they had like some weird interpretation in the Bible. Trying to see which part she was talking about. Oh yeah, this is actually what it says right here. Huh. I always thought that it said you shall not have any false idols, but
Lord your God am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments.
Investing is not for everyone, right? Wrong. Wealth comes from pennies. Like oaks come from acorns. Wealth comes from the decision to invest, to bury your acorns, give them time to grow into a mighty oak like squirrels do. And if a squirrel can be an investor.
Whoo! I always just heard that it was don't carve an idol, but this is so much more loaded. You shall not make a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So this isn't just don't have idols. This is, hey, do not make carvings that depict anything on heaven or earth or anything else. You're not allowed to carve. No carving for you, okay? But this is the second commandment.
I don't think it exactly.
Okay, the first commandment is, hey, no other gods. The second commandment is don't carve things. And certainly don't bow down and serve them. Why? Because God is jealous. And because God visits the iniquity of the father.
I think that he means don't carve things that you are going to serve. I think
on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate him. So in God's perfect moral code that is meant to be an example for all people on how to live a perfect, moral, righteous life, God is explaining that he is so jealous for his people, and that if they do bad things, he's going to punish their children in the third and fourth generation for that, because, that's the right moral thing to do, I guess. Like, how is this a part of this perfect moral system? Like, how many of you watching this didn't realize that God was celebrating kin punishment in his perfect moral system? Because I totally forgot about this. I'm just wondering why this is even in here, why the celebration of kin punishment is in this perfect moral system. And I wonder how many people don't realize that this says this or even thinks about it when they read it. How many Christians read through the Ten Commandments, read that God is punishing children for the sins of their parents, which is just a completely immoral and awful thing to do. They're reading that and they're just going right through it. And they're like, yeah, this is perfect. This is a great moral system. Let's put this in our classrooms. And then, of course, it says, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments.
This
so if you
really
love me and you do everything I say, well, then I'll show you my love. But you must earn it, which is weird because God doesn't need to earn our love. So it seems really one-sided. Verse 11, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, I've learned in the last several years that taking God's name in vain is not what people used to tell me that it was. I used to believe that taking God's name in vain was like using God's name in a cuss word or saying, oh my God. Here's a fun story. When I was in youth group, I had a friend who was also the pastor's daughter, and she told me that if anyone ever said, oh my God, that would be blasphemy and that they would never be forgiven for that. And if I had ever said, oh my God, in the past, that I just could not be forgiven. And I probably spent a couple of weeks living in absolute fear because I had said, oh my God before, and I was taking the Lord's name in vain and I was being blasphemous. So I lived in complete fear that I was going to hell and there was nothing I could do about it because I was never going to be forgiven. So that was pretty funny. It's funny that it came from the pastor's kid. But this whole idea of taking the Lord's name in vain, I mean, if you just say it, taking the Lord's name in vain, obviously, like when you're doing something in vain, you're doing something, kind of for yourself or to promote your own agenda. And so when it says don't take the name of the Lord in vain, I think what it's saying is don't use the name of God to promote your own agenda, or promote your own ungodly agenda. And if you look around at pretty much every pastor and church and televangelist and Christian political leader, I think that's exclusively what they're doing is taking the name of God and they're using it to promote their own agenda. So I think that we could accuse every Christian leader of doing this in some capacity. But we are 3 of these commandments in. There's only 10 of them. We're 3 in, and we've got don't have any other gods, do not make an idol for yourself, don't carve any images and don't bow down to them, and don't take the Lord's name in vain. So the first 3 are all about how you can serve God, how you can make God happy.
Obviously, because he's
going,
the most important.
It goes into verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock. So your donkey can't work on Sunday. Okay. It says you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath.
It also says that you're not supposed to that you don't have to let your sheep starve, so you can still go feed your animals and stuff.
So
he's just saying, like, in the most part, don't work on the Sabbath. And that's kind of a thing for us, so that we have a day of rest, not...
Kind of nice, I guess. Hey, make sure you rest on this day, but if you don't, you will be killed, is pretty much what it says later on. So we are almost halfway through these 10 verses. We're 40% of the way through the 10 commandments. And not one time has God talked about how you're supposed to treat your fellow human beings. It's so far all been about how to treat God, how to make God feel really good, how to boost God's ego. And those are the most important commandments to this God at this point in time. Now, it's really fascinating. If you actually look at the text and you see how much text is here versus how much text is to come with the other verses or with the other commandments, I think it's so fascinating that he spends so much time elaborating on these first 4 commandments about how I'm so great and I'm God and I did this for you and you're supposed to follow me and great am I. And this is why you're supposed to follow me. But then it goes on to kind of shift focus from God and onto other people. And it's just like spouted out really quick. So he starts with verse 16, honor your father and mother as the Lord commanded you, that your days may be long and may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God has given you. So again, honor your father and mother because God commanded you, because God gave you this land. This is still kind of all about God, and the the kind of explanation given is still about kind of God's ego and how great he is. And then it just says, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. They're just straight into the point, no explanation given. It's not, hey, don't murder because the people around you deserve love and respect and they're God's people and he loves.
I mean, why would he have to explain that? It's pretty obvious why he would say not to murder.
Them too. There's no like extra information given here. It's just, hey, don't murder. Moving on. We don't need to explain. As if it was so much more important to explain how great God was in these first few verses about how you could fill his ego. And then the stuff about other people is just kind of added on as a quick second thought. But going back up, it says, honor your mother and father as the Lord commanded you, that your days may be long. What if your mother and father are serial killers? What if they're abusers?
I think
what if
that
they're not Christian and they want to worship these other way? Want you?
I think that there's definitely caveats to that. I don't think that it's
to make carved images. They say, hey, we got to worship these other gods, and we want you to carve an image of this god and bow down to it. Well, are you supposed to not make a carved image and bow down to it and respect God, or are you supposed to honor your mother and father? Because these are now 2 conflicting things. And I know what the Christian will say. They'll say God comes first. I've talked to religious leaders or Christian leaders about how you honor a parent that isn't worthy of honor. And I know that's a tricky one in Christian circles. There's a lot of nuance there, and I can appreciate that. But if you're just reading and you're saying these are the rules, you're supposed to always honor your parents? Always? Even when your parents aren't worthy of honor, even when your parents are doing bad things? You have to break the 10 commandments in order to honor people that might be doing things that are very bad. Being a parent doesn't make you a good person. And so it's interesting that there's this emphasis on you have to honor your mother and father, and there's no exception given. There's no, but if your mother and father are bad people, don't honor them. It doesn't say that. It just doesn't say
there's
that.
stuff in the rest of the Bible that does say that, though.
For nuance. And I just think that the ultimate moral code for all people should probably give a little more explanation and give a little more nuance and give exceptions to the rule. Unless there's no exception to the rule and God still wants you to honor your parents even if they're really bad people. Verse 17, you shall not murder. Great. Okay, that's a good one. I'm just wondering if it's considered murder when God drowns the entire world in a flood, or if it's considered murder when God instructs his people to go around to all of the neighboring cities and to attack them and kill them all and save the women and children as plunder. I wonder if that was murder when they were killing all of the people in all the surrounding cities because they didn't want to worship this God. I mean, according to John 3:16, God gave up his only son. So technically God murdered his own son. And so I think it's interesting that God can murder over and over and over again throughout the Bible, but you shall not murder, because God is always going to hold you to a higher standard than he holds himself. Kind of like how the church and the pastors are always going to hold you to a higher standard than they themselves hold. You shall not commit adultery. Okay, fine.
I didn't hear what she said.
And kill them all and save the women and children as plunder. I wonder if that... Okay, that's a good one. I'm just wondering if it's considered murder when God drowns the entire world in a flood, or if it's considered murder when God instructs his people to go around to all of the neighboring cities and to attack them and kill them all and save the women and children as plunder. I wonder if that was murder when they were killing all of the people in all the surrounding cities because they didn't want to worship this God. I mean, according to John 3:16, God gave up his only son. So technically God murdered his own son. And so I think it's interesting that God can murder over and over and over.
No, he didn't murder his own son. We humans murdered Jesus. God didn't
again
murder
throughout the Bible,
Jesus.
but you shall not murder, because God is always going to hold you to a higher
And
standard.
Jesus
than
is
he holds
himself.
Kind of like how the
too.
church
So he
and the pastors are
accepted-
always going to hold you
he
to a higher
let
standard
us
than they
murder
themselves
him,
hold. You shall not
basically.
commit adultery.
What?
Okay, fine. Where's the one about rape? Where's the one that says you shall not rape? Because cheating is pretty bad. You know, you probably shouldn't break that trust with your partner.
I'm sure it's implied.
I agree. Don't commit adultery, but also don't rape people. And I think that that's a more important rule. Maybe he could have slid that one in somewhere. I'm not seeing it yet. Not yet. However, in verse 19, it says, you shall not steal. And I have to point out that countless times when I have pointed out the fact that the Bible does not say don't rape, that Christians respond and they say, well, it says don't steal. And when you're raping, you're stealing something from someone else or taking something that's not yours. So technically that's stealing. So rape falls into that. As if God couldn't have been specific. God didn't say, do not carve an image of anything under earth or of earth or whatever. You know, don't make a carved image. But he can't say don't rape. He's very specific in other areas, but for some reason we just have to assume
This is so stupid.
that rape falls under this umbrella of don't steal. And I think that that's very convenient for this book that never actually condemns rape, ever. Like the Bible never says don't rape people. It's not nice. It just, it really condones it more so than it condemns it.
What do you
You
mean
shall not steal.
it condones
Okay,
it?
well, what if your child is starving and you need to feed them in order to keep them alive?
I
There's
think
no
that
nuance
there's
here. It doesn't say don't
I think
steal.
that there's reasons why
but
you...
if
I think that he would allow those types
your child
of
is
things.
starving, then do what you have to do. There's no nuance there. Shouldn't there be more than just don't steal? Shouldn't there be some elaboration? He could elaborate on the holy day. He could elaborate on not taking his name in vain. He can elaborate on not making a carved image, but he cannot elaborate on not stealing. He can't make exceptions. He can't provide the nuance in that very weird black and white rule, because do not steal is so broad. And it's like, how do you know where to draw the line on that one? Is it really a sin for someone to steal to feed themselves or their family? It's stealing, and there's no exception made. It doesn't say, do what you got to do. So I'm just wondering, where is there an exception in that? It's not clear. There's no clarity there. And I would think that God would be able to provide a little bit more clarity for things like that for people who are genuinely curious. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie. Okay. All right, God. So you're way more concerned with people lying than you are with people raping other people. Got it. Also, where's the one about not owning people as property?
Stupid.
Do not own people as property. They are not your slaves. They are human beings. The Lord your God has made each individual person a sentient being that deserves autonomy. I don't see that one anywhere in here. But don't tell a lie. That's really important. Make sure you do not lie. Own people as property, that's good and fine. Lying, that's very, very bad. And lastly, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's.
Hey Transplay nerds, it's your favorite part of every session. You guessed it, sponsor Connie. If you play
This is so
TTRPGs,
stupid. I mean, if you read the
Notice
rest of the Bible, there's a lot of
that
stuff that says...
everything being listed here is the Israelites' property. So don't desire your neighbor's house, his field, his servant, his ox, his donkey, and lumped in with that is his wife. Now, we can see right here, we're just talking about him not condemning slavery, saying don't own people. Well, here he's basically saying you can have a servant, just don't be jealous of your neighbor's servant. You're allowed to have slaves. In this perfect moral code, he's endorsing slavery. Although, of course, there are going to be people who these were...
How is it? He did not...
bondservants, and
endorse
maybe they
slavery.
were. Maybe they were, but they were still considered property, as this verse shows. And I don't think anybody should be considered anybody else's property, especially not somebody's wife. And so notice how the
Also, slavery back then was a completely different form of slavery than what most Americans think of when you think of slavery nowadays. Slavery back then was like if someone owed you money, then you could have them work for you for a certain amount of time until they paid you back. That's what a slave was back then. But we have this thought that it's just what happened like to the blacks in this country.
Bible is literally putting a woman in not even second class. Like, I don't even think you can call the woman second class in this situation. She is property. She is the neighbor's wife. She is
It also says to love your wife in the
not her
Bible,
own person. She is his property, along with his donkey, his field, and his
Love and
servants.
respect your
This
wife,
is
too.
clearly showing that this biblical author did not see women as their own beings, that they saw women as the property of men. And this is a theme throughout the Bible. And you would think that this God who never changes and who is so great, and with God there's no male or there's no female, there's no slave, there's no free, everybody is just equal and the same. You would think that this God would set up a system by which women were their own people, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. It seems as though the wife is the property, and God is saying, hey, don't be jealous. Don't be jealous of your neighbor's wife, because that is so much more important than don't own people as property and don't rape. I think it's...
It didn't say that that's...
fascinating
What?
that we have really come around here to don't covet, don't be jealous, when in verse
This shit's
8,
so
you shall not
stupid,
make yourself
bro.
a carved image, any likeness that is anything on heaven, in heaven above or earth beneath. Don't bow down to them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So God is jealous for his people. Why? Because he doesn't want them to go and worship other gods. Why? Because he's envious of the people of those other gods. He's literally saying, don't be jealous of what your neighbor has. But if there are other gods and they are God's neighbor, then he is jealous of what the other gods have when other people go and worship him. He says,
but he's God.
Don't go and worship other gods because I'm jealous. I'm jealous for you. I don't like it when other gods have your attention. But you better not be jealous of your neighbor's wife or his donkey or his ox. Like, do you see how very human this is? How very patriarchal this is? How
patriarchy.
They have very clearly set up a system by which God, the man, he is great. He is to be revered. You must not do anything against him. You must not speak out against him. You must honor him. You must obey him. It's very clear to see that this was not designed to create a perfect moral system and to create a system by which all people are well and free and happy. This was just to keep people in line, to keep people blind and obedient and doing whatever God says. And when I just sit down and read it, I am so far from seeing this perfect moral system. I think that we could come up with such a better system for how you're supposed to behave. One that doesn't include treating women as property.
But
one
you're
that doesn't
not
include
God. I think that God probably can make a better moral system than you.
We're seeing owning people as property, making them your property, making them your slave. One that doesn't just focus on building up God's ego, even though God does whatever he wants and admits to punishing children for the crimes of their parents. We could create a much better system that doesn't look like this. And with that being said, let's compare what we just read in Deuteronomy about the 10 Commandments to the 7 tenets of the Satanic Temple. Now, when Christians hear this, they're going to clutch their pearls and go,
yeah, these are all super evil.
oh my goodness, not the Satanic Temple. But, listen and decide for yourself what you think is the superior moral guide. One should strive to act with compassion and empathy toward all creatures in accordance with reason. Wow, how demonic is that? The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. Christians love justice, okay? They always talk about how much they love justice, how important justice is. And here we are, already talking about justice in the second tenet of the Satanic Temple. One's body is inviolable, subject to one's will alone. So bodily autonomy, you have freedom. Aren't Christians always talking about how important free will is? This is free will. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. Which, again, I think Christians would love this one because it even says you have the freedom to offend, and the Christians love to talk about how offensive their message is, and they should have the freedom to share it. So far, this is really supporting the Christian mission. Beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care to never to distort scientific facts to fit one's belief. I know that the Christians won't like that one because they prefer blind faith in things that they can't prove over science, even though those that are disagreeing with this right now are watching this through technology that was invented using science. So they do trust science when it suits them, just not when it comes to the really important stuff. And the next one is people are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused.
One for Israel. Thompson, take one.
Again, it's so demonic. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. I wonder how many Christians have actually read the tenets of the Satanic Temple and if they've ever actually compared them to their own God's rules, and how you can look at the two and think that the 10 Commandments is a superior moral system when it has nothing to do with free will. It has nothing to do with being compassionate toward people. This actually makes a tenet to live in compassion, to be active in your compassion. But notice how in the 10 Commandments, there's nothing about active compassion. It says don't murder, don't steal, don't be jealous. It's things that you shouldn't do. But it doesn't actually give you any further rules to act compassionately. Now, Christians will say Jesus came along and he reinterpreted the law and he made it clear you're supposed to love your neighbor. And that's great. But if we're just paying attention to the 10 Commandments and what the 10 Commandments say, I am not seeing any call to be a genuinely good person that wants to spread love and compassion and goodness. I see a set of rules that is designed to keep people focused on God, obeying God, worshiping God.
I mean, this was also during the time after when they were in the desert. So it's, I mean, yeah, we should base our life on this, but this is
there's no
also
call to serve others like there is to serve God. And God put us here with everyone else, and he expects our sole focus to be him and his needs and serving him. And I'm wondering, why? What does God get out of
otherwise
being
you're
served by
serving
human beings?
yourself.
What can human beings do to serve a God who can do anything for himself? Why does this God need to be worshipped? Why does he care if you're looking at other gods or making a carved image or taking his name in vain? Okay, yeah, taking his name in vain, that one I actually agree with, actually. Just because, a lot of people use God for their own agenda and it causes a lot of harm. So that's one I'm going to stick with. But the others, it's so focused.
Because if we focus on ourselves, then we don't know how to act.
On how
if we focus on God, then we can act, and then
it really
we will
has such a minute
live a much
focus on
better
how
life.
you can actually serve other human beings. And if we're all here with human beings and God is just up there in the distant land kind of residing over everything, why does he need to be served? Or why does he need us to pay attention to him? Why can't he give us rules to be kind to our fellow human beings, since that's who we have to live and interact with on a daily basis? And just at the end of the day, I just think that these 10 commandments are just a way to kind of uphold this patriarchal system, this standard that people don't really think about. So many people love the 10 commandments. They want the 10 commandments up to be seen. They think that they're a great moral code, and they don't really actually read or think about it. They know the 10 commandments, but they don't read the words. They don't read the context, the things that are being said in between, and the general focus of this, which is not to be a good human being and to spread love and compassion into the world. It's to serve God, because he really, really needs you to serve him. And that's why he created you, so he could be served by you. And that is the whole point of these commands. I think I could come up with a better system. I think the Satanic Temple has come up with a better system. And if God is truly a God of love and compassion and goodness, then he would have put out a system by which people would be encouraged to be loving and compassionate. But instead, all this system does is give people the feeling of superiority, where they can kind of stand up, point their fingers at everyone else and say, these are God's rules and you must follow them. But it has nothing to do with being moral. It has nothing to do with
My name is Gabby. My job is to figure out how to get people to our website. That's why I use SEMrush. They have all the tools that I need to help me expand our audience and grow.
Hi Ben, thank you for coming. I just wanted to ask, what is your view on the fact that bans on abortion do lead to about a 21% increase in pregnancy-related deaths, when you hold that your views on abortion and abortion bans are based in the fact that you have a desire to protect life and save lives because every human being is made in God's image?
Because I think we're going to have a fundamental disconnect here. The entire abortion debate is centered on whether indeed an unborn child or a human life with potential is in fact that, or if it is just a ball of cells. If you believe that there is inherent value to a fetus, then I am seeking to preserve that life as well as the life of the mother. If you look at the raw numbers in terms of, for example, in the United States, 1 million abortions a year, let's assume that laws banning abortion in the United States were universal, those 1 million abortions go away tomorrow. That's an effective law, the abortions go away, but there's also a concomitant increase in the number of women who are seeking back alley abortions, for example. There's a concomitant increase in the number of women who are dying in pregnancy-related childbirth. That would not be 1 million. That would be a lot lower than 1 million, because 1 million women out of 1 million women, that would suggest that 1 million abortions would, if brought to term, 1 million of those women would die. That's obviously not true. So for me, an abortion prevented is a life saved. And you have to weigh that against what you're talking about, which is the life of the mother when it comes to a pregnancy. Now, even as a fan of pro-life position, and I'm a deeply pro-life person, I still have an exception for the life of the mother. So if the life of the mother is endangered by a pregnancy, then abortion would be legal. That's true for every pro-lifer in the United States, by the way, including most pro-life people, including me. So, you know, I think that in order to make the argument that you're making, you would have to assume that there is no cost to abortion remaining legal in terms of lives lost.
Okay, so you're doing it on a utilitarian basis.
Well, I'm doing it on a lives saved basis, yes.
Well, yeah, so a utilitarian basis,
sure.
right. So then if you look at comprehensive sex education, which the US does not have, a lot of people in rural areas don't have any form of sex education, you yourself have said, and I quote, on a general level, I don't think that teachers should be talking about sex in the classroom with kids at all at any age. It's shown that comprehensive and correct sex education reduces rates of abortion and teen pregnancy. So then if your goal is to save lives, why do you not support comprehensive sex education? Because it seems like your goal is something else.
No, because these first of all, I would like to see the studies that you're citing in support of that.
So that study is the University of Washington.
Okay, and there are plenty of other studies in the United States that suggest essentially no difference in, for example, unwed pregnancy in the United States.
Can I have those studies?
What can you have them? You can look at the pregnancy rates in California, New York, Massachusetts.
I just gave you my reference.
I mean, I'm happy to email you references if you so choose. But to say, I mean, this does happen to be a topic where there is social science on both sides. I'm not saying that the study that you're citing is invalid. I'm just suggesting that there is a difference in data methods, and I'm suggesting that the single motherhood rates in the West with comprehensive sex education are miles higher than they were in, say, the 1950s when there was not comprehensive sex education. So obviously that is not militated against the amount of unwed pregnancy happening in society. So the idea that the cure-all here is comprehensive sex ed, if you could prove to me, let's put it this way, if you could prove to me that comprehensive sex ed did result in lower levels of abortion, lower levels of unwed pregnancy, and that it was values neutral, comprehensive sex ed, in the sense that what it was actually teaching is, here is how to prevent the pregnancy without ending it in abortion, then I actually don't have a huge problem with that. It depends on the age at which you're teaching kids. There are other issues that I have with comprehensive sex ed, including the fact that what is taught is not the simple biology of sex and how to prevent a pregnancy. Comprehensive sex ed simply goes a lot further than that, and I have serious problems with that.
It seems like you're just trying to force women into motherhood, not save lives.
What did she say?
I mean, just...
I couldn't hear what that person said.
Respond briefly to that. I'm confused as to the very language of forcing women into motherhood suggests that in the vast majority of cases in which women get pregnant, they had no part in the actual pregnancy-making act, which is not true. I've done nothing.
Yeah.
If you or any of your friends get pregnant, that is generally not...
It's nothing like what the Handmaid's Tale is.
Having anything to do with me, per se. So I'm confused as to why I would want you to force anything. Gotta tell you, it's been a very stressful period. Been traveling a lot. It's hard for me to get my fruits and veggies. I don't like the veggies all that much to begin with. This is why I've been relying on Balance of Nature. Balance of Nature fruits and veggies are a great way to make sure you're getting essential nutritional ingredients every single day. Balance of Nature uses an advanced .com Good Ranchers American meat delivered.
Thank you so much for your time. My question is sort of going back to the topic of Israel and Palestine, and specifically focused on Resolution 242. And just to give a context to the audience, like what Resolution 242 is. So in 1967, the United Nations passed Resolution 242, and this legislation requested that Israelite armed forces retreated from the territories occupied during the recent conflict.
From territories occupied,
yes,
not territories.
Yes,
It's actually a real distinction in the law.
Yes,
It makes a big difference,
territories. Yeah, sorry. And it also stressed the importance of resolving the refugee issue justly, and also encouraged the end of the belligerency claims in states. However, the resolution did not explicitly state which territories Israel had to withdraw from because of the ambiguities in the language of the English version versus the French version. And this ambiguity kind of is being used as a resolution, by the Israelites to justify its continued occupation of some territories. And furthermore, although the resolution mentioned a just resolution for the refugee issue, it failed to clearly address the right of the Palestinian people to statehood. And from my understanding, that is the reason why a lot of the Arab nations sort of reject the resolution. So my question for you is, if you were in their shoe, if you're a Palestinian, aware that there's impreciseness within the resolution that will potentially put your people in disadvantage, how would you respond to that, and whether you will accept the partisan deal?
I didn't hear this question.
Resolution 242. And
what went wrong in our culture? Start here. The fear, the anger, the shouting.
Just to give a context to the audience, like what Resolution 242 is. So in 1967, the United Nations passed Resolution 242, and this legislation requested that Israelite armed forces retreated from the territories occupied during the recent conflict.
From territories occupied,
yes,
not territories.
Yes,
It's actually a real distinction in the law.
Yes,
It makes a big difference,
territories. Yeah, sorry. And it also stressed the importance of resolving the refugee issue justly, and also encouraged the end of the belligerency claims in states. However, the resolution did not explicitly state which territories Israel had to withdraw from because of the ambiguities in the language of the English version versus the French version. And this ambiguity kind of is being used as a resolution, by the Israelites to justify its continued occupation of some territories. And furthermore, although the resolution mentioned a just resolution for the refugee issue, it failed to clearly address the right of the Palestinian people to statehood. And from my understanding, that is the reason why a lot of the Arab nations sort of reject the resolution. So my question for you is, if you were in their shoe, if you're a Palestinian, aware that there's impreciseness within the resolution that will potentially put your people in disadvantage, how would you respond to that, and whether you will accept the partisan deal or will you reject it? And before you answer, I'm ready to be destroyed by Ben Shapiro.
So, I mean, the answer, if I were a Palestinian citizen, which fortunately I'm not because it's horrible to live under the Palestinian Authority or Islamic Jihad or Hamas, but if I were, I hope that what I'd be doing is pressing for a full-scale attempt at a peace deal that would involve a two-state solution. The biggest problem with the two-state solution right now is that one side wishes to exist and the other side wishes it not to, and that's a serious problem. So if that were to alleviate, there's been heavy movement for decades.
If I were the devil, if I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness. And I'd have a third of its real estate and 4/5 of its population, but I wouldn't be happy until I had seized the ripest apple on the tree, thee. So I'd set about, however necessary, to take over the United States. I'd subvert the churches first. I'd begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve. Do as you please. To the young, I would whisper that the Bible is a myth. I would convince them that man created God instead of the other way around. I would confide that what's bad is good and what's good is square. And the old I would teach to pray after me, Our Father, which art in Washington. I'd educate authors in how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd threaten TV with dirtier movies and vice versa. I'd peddle narcotics to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves, until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. If I were the devil, I would encourage schools to refine young intellects, but neglect to discipline emotions, just let those run wild. Until before you knew it, you'd have to have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing. I'd have judges promoting pornography. Soon I could evict God from the courthouse, then from the schoolhouse, and then from the houses of Congress. And in his own churches, I would substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I would lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd make the symbol of Easter an egg and the symbol of Christmas a bottle. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who want it until I had killed the incentive of the ambitious. What'll you bet? I couldn't get whole states to promote gambling. as the way to get rich. I would caution against extremes in hard work, in patriotism, in moral conduct. I would convince the young that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, that what you see on TV is the way to be. And thus I could undress you in public, and I could lure you into bed with diseases for which there is no cure. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing.
John Doyle in. Heck off, Tommy.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Heck Off Commie. Wasn't that a fun intro? This took a while to put together, so thank you for being patient with me. But as I'm sure you know, there is a long-standing tradition in right-wing politics of simply accusing the left, the liberals, the Democrats of being satanic. This is from where the concept of the democrat is derived. And I think what we're going to discover today is a further vindication of our old friend, the horseshoe theory of practical intelligence, which illustrates the unity between those of us who are below average intelligence, who are quick to berate the Democrats, the Democrats, accuse Barack Obama, Anthony Fauci of being the Antichrist, etc., and those of us who are of above average intelligence, realizing the philosophical overlap between liberalism, leftism, Satanism, and understanding the implications of that overlap as demonstrated in the intro. And then it's the two of our factions against those of average intelligence who would say things like, hey, you did an anti-science? Sweetie, you must know the morality is subjective. Let people do things. There's no heckin' sky, daddy. Demons aren't real or Reno, kiddo, but science is. I freaking love science. These people are the worst people ever. And when we take the culture back, we're going to make sure that everybody knows that the default enemy in a video game or like a blockbuster film is not going to be a Russian anymore. It's not going to be a Nazi anymore. No, it's going to be a Reddit user. We're going to deepfake all the classics. We're going to have Reddit users hunting for the Ark of the Covenant, Black Ops, 25th Anniversary Edition. Dimitri is gassed to death by Redditors. It's called accountability. It's called don't be an asshole. I'm excited for the future, but seriously, I'm not going to tell you that you have to believe in demons or Satan or anything like that, even though my job is literally to promote my beliefs, but for some reason people want to draw the line of religion. That's fine. I'm just going to demonstrate to you that the overlap between Satanism and basically everything left-wing is practically one-to-one. And so it therefore is not a coincidence that basically all of the evil that is plaguing our society is being pushed by the left or by people on the right who are really allied with the left. And this doesn't mean that if you're right-wing, you're like inherently a good person, or even that if you're left-wing, you're inherently a bad person, though you are operating within the coalition that is promoting that evil, and so you're really only going to be able to plead ignorance for so long, I think. But the point of all of this is just to show you that no, it's probably not a coincidence that one of the biggest organizations that is spearheading the pushback against the Texas pro-life laws is the literal satanic temple, etc. So just bear with me, listen all the way through, at least hear me out, and then give it some thought after. And if you're relatively new to the channel, you'll remember that we touched on this before in other videos. I think we covered it especially well, I will say, in how the 2010s changed politics forever, in particular how all of the 7 deadly sins are being promoted heavily by the left throughout society. So I would definitely recommend watching that after this. I'll put a link to it in the description, but this will be the first deep dive that we've done into this in particular. So I want to start with illustrating the differences between right-wing people and left-wing people. And there is a core difference. And then we're going to get into the philosophical overlap between liberalism and Satanism, as demonstrated by the Satanic Temple and the Church of Satan, how this is related to drag queen story hour and abortion. So much to get to. But yeah, a lot of people have this approach of like, oh, both sides are the same. One side can't be correct about everything. I'm a centrist. I'm smarter than both sides. And we call those people gay. And then you've got other people who take this approach of, oh, right-wing means small government, left-wing means big government, which means that fascism and communism are the same thing, which is why they fought a brutal war against each other. And this makes sense to me. And it makes sense to him because he is a part of another group that we call retarded. So the point being, because obviously we're joking, we're busting your chops, it's all in good fun, but the point is that there is a core difference between the two philosophies, regardless of whether those who claim to represent them in government actually demonstrate that. And it is essentially the acceptance or rejection of hierarchy. It is equality versus hierarchy. It is idealism versus reality and or pragmatism. It is nurture versus nature. Think about that, because those are the differences. And I don't want to get too deep into this in this particular video, but I'll give you some examples here. So the right-wing individual acknowledges nature. He acknowledges that there are natural differences, that some things are objectively better than others, that some people are more skilled in certain areas and weaker in other areas, that no two people are exactly alike or equal, etc. He acknowledges that human nature is flawed, and because of this, he does not support these utopian ideas because they would never work, and of course they failed every time they've been tried. And because he acknowledges nature, he believes that it is better to live in accordance with it instead of trying to like challenge it. And because he acknowledges that man is flawed, he's skeptical of man and of human nature. This is why he takes his right to defend himself very seriously, etc. The left-wing individual is exactly opposite. Like the founders of liberalism, which is just proto-leftism, because in a long enough timeline, liberalism will logically devolve into leftism because of the natural progressions of the conclusions upon which liberalism is based. See the United States of America. It is unavoidable. We touched on this more heavily in the last video that we did, but like the founder of liberalism, John Locke, the left-wing individual believes that all people are equal. Not that they should just be treated equally, like literally they are equal, and that any differences between them are just a result of their environments. Maybe they grew up poor or oppressed, etc., and that we could achieve total equality with the elimination of those differences through an apparatus with enough power to do so, such as the state. He also believes that people are basically good, and that because of this, everyone should just be free to do whatever they want, whatever makes them happy, and the only problems in the world are when people who must be driven by this like blind, irrational hatred, they come in and they say, sometimes people should not be allowed to do certain things. Or maybe that blind, irrational hatred leads them to oppress or discriminate against people. And this is why whenever something bad happens or whenever people are in bad circumstances, it can always be fixed by just giving them more money, giving them more access to opportunities, giving them housing, etc. And if someone points out that literally none of these things has ever fixed anything, well, then he will highlight that to suggest that is racist, and he'll try to lose that person their job. And because everyone is the same and nature is nothing but a concept, the only things that bind us are all socially constructed. Therefore, if I want to be a woman, I can be a woman by simply declaring it, because I'm a hyper-autonomous individual. If I want to abort my child, I can abort my child because it is inconvenient to my desires, which when stripped of all identity and everything else in order to achieve that status as the hyper-autonomous individual, that's all that remains to define me, desire. There's no such thing as culture, as country, morality, gender. It's all man-made. I am bound by none of it. It It is all about me. I believe that human nature is basically good because I'm a narcissist who believes that they're a good person who can do no wrong, and that's why policies are judged by their intentions instead of their results, because their results are mean. And that's basically what it boils down to. And you can prove this to yourself by running it, like the simple thought experiments, and it works every time. You just take any point of disagreement between the left and the right, and 100% of the time it can be traced back to the rejection versus the acknowledgement of nature, of hierarchy, and of reality. 100% of the time, that is the difference. Do we acknowledge what is objective, what is natural, and work to live in accordance with it, or do we reject it in favor of these subjective desires, like what we feel should be? That is the defining question between the two. Speaking of defining questions, I have a question for you before we continue. Do you want to be the guy that just gives out generic gift cards for Christmas? Of course you don't. And it's almost time to start thinking about the holiday season, and the first item on your list needs to be iTarget Pro. This revolutionary system allows evil in a long enough timeline. It's unavoidable, it is inexorable, and the reason for this is very simply that man is flawed. The founding fathers understood this. If you're Christian, you understand this. Stay sharp with almost any firearm. So go to itargetpro.com right now, save 10% plus get free shipping with the offer code Doyle. This is the smartest way for you to practice, and it pays for itself literally in one day. That's the letter itargetpro.com, itargetpro.com, offer code Doyle. Very epic. So before we get into specific examples, I want to give a very general explanation of why liberalism will unavoidably end with the widespread promotion of evil in a long enough timeline. It's unavoidable, it is inexorable, and the reason for this is very simply that man is flawed. The founding fathers understood this. If you're Christian, you understand this, that man is fallen, he is predisposed towards sin, or more broadly speaking, evil. And contrary to what a lot of U.S. history textbooks will tell you, the founding fathers were largely very religious, specifically Christian. Like, you can read their journals and their letters and see that this is basically the case. But what the founding fathers failed to predict when laying the foundations of our country, geniuses as they may have been, was the true necessity of proactive maintenance of the societal institutions which they took for granted in order to have a safe, free, moral, and prosperous nation. What I mean by that is the church, the community, the family. Those are all the things that comprise the backbone of the nation. If those are all strong, you can operate under that framework every day of the week and twice on Sunday, and everything will be fine. Like, everything's going to run like clockwork. But the problem is that when the ideas that facilitate that framework are exploited and traced to their logical conclusions, the social institutions upon which the stability of that society is dependent will eventually erode to roughly where they are now. So think about it this way. Man is flawed. If he is left totally free, if he is bound by nothing except his divine will, there will be evil. Every act of evil ever committed can be traced back to selfishness if analyzed correctly. The same way that a compass will always point north if it's working correctly. And this is why liberalism will always lead to evil, because it's set out to literally liberate the individual from all constraints, to create this hyper-autonomous individual who is bound by nothing but himself, not by family, not by culture, not by religion, not by morality, because of course that's all subjective, not by country nor heritage, nothing. That was the whole point. And 200 some years later, you can see how these ideas have devolved into leftism. Well, I don't need to listen to biology. If I say I'm a woman, then I'm a woman. I don't have to listen to your morality that says that murdering unborn children is wrong. It's my body, me. This is all me. Esoteric Far Cry 3 reference. But it's literally a breeding ground for narcissism and evil, and I don't even say that pejoratively. Like, we are now living through the consequences of this experiment. Edmund Burke wrote this in Reflections on the Revolution in France, one of the founding conservative texts. He said that you cannot have freedom without order. And to a lot of us, this sounds weird because we've been taught to prioritize total freedom above all else, above God, above everything. The ultimate good and end is simply freedom. And I like freedom just as much as the next guy. So when I say this, it's not because I don't want people to be free. It's because I actually understand the conditions necessary to maintain that freedom in society, because I'm blessed enough to be able to study the history of these things for a living. So thank you for that. But total freedom incentivizes man to pursue his own self-destruction through vice, and it encourages powerful people in society to further incentivize it by profiting from it and advertising it. Like, there are people living in multi-million-dollar homes right now who have built their fortunes by designing algorithms to get advertising revenue by exposing your children and addicting them to internet pornography. Is that freedom? Freedom to become a slave to your desires? Freedom to pursue your preferred method of self-destruction? They're telling you that slavery is freedom, just like freedom is slavery, like Orwell said. Think about that. They're telling you that to be a slave to your desires is to be free, and to be truly free and in control of your desires is to be a slave to things like morality, religion, etc. No, freedom is discipline. Freedom is order, and there is a difference. And this gets back to that key distinction. Is man basically good, or is he flawed? Look at how this manifests in terms of how each side of the aisle regards the concept of rights. Conservatives tend to share the founding fathers' concept of rights, that rights are God-given, that they are negative rights. Also, on this note, the only reason you have rights in this country is because they are God-given, and God definitely did not want you to have a right to an abortion, or even if you don't subscribe to that line of thinking. The only reason you would have rights is as an acknowledgement of your value as a human being, which would acknowledge the value of all human beings, which would mean that you couldn't kill them when convenient to you. We're going to talk about abortion a little bit more later, a lot of it more later. But the negative view of rights is basically rights of omission, that we have the right to do things without others imposing themselves. I have a right to speak, you cannot prevent that. I have a right to own a firearm, you cannot prevent that. I have a right to live, you cannot prevent that, etc. You could literally stay inside all day while I exercise my rights and do nothing about it, and we would be square. That's how we regard rights, because we acknowledge that man is flawed. And because man is flawed, we need to make sure that we have our rights protected, because if not, he might try to shut my speech down, he might try to take my property, he might try to kill me, etc. The left has a diametrically opposite view of rights. They view rights to be positive rights. Positive rights are satanic. Here's why. A positive right is a right of commission. It's requiring others to take action. It's not that they should get out of the way so that you can do as you will, like a negative right. No, a positive right is a right of entitlement. It says, I have a right to healthcare, I have a right to housing, I have a right to food, etc. And we all know the Ben Shapiro explanations of why that is not economically viable, but the point being that the positive rights require direct action from others to be fulfilled, even if at gunpoint, like we've seen throughout history. Whereas the negative rights just require you to chill out, basically. So here we see the connection between these things, the positive rights and leftism, and then Satanism, and then the negative rights in Christianity and conservatism. And some people will say, oh, but John, no, negative rights are a liberal idea. Yeah, maybe in theory, but again, liberalism in a long enough timeline will inevitably devolve into leftism. I see where you're going with that. We're not quite there yet, but liberalism, as we've been talking about, is fundamentally about the eternal and ultimate autonomy of the individual, which is just another way of describing selfishness, like the literal infatuation with the self. And on this note, really quickly, a very common straw man that I get in response to this when I say this is, well, John Doyle has a problem with the individual, and he thinks it's selfish to want to be left alone. And it's like, no, obviously, that's not the point. And maybe if you stop smoking so much marijuana and watching so much pornography, your brain would be able to process what I'm saying. Here's the best illustration of the difference. If you asked me or anybody who thinks like me, hey, do you have an obligation to help out your neighbor or your family member or whoever?
Yes,
we'd be like,
you do.
Yeah. And yet we still want to be left alone. No one wants to not be left alone. The difference is that it's always the people who go on about how they just want to be left alone above all else. These are the people who say, I'm not obligated to do anything unless I've entered into a contractual agreement with another individual. And if you disagree, your status. And it's like, come on, man. Like, if we ever get back to a point where we can just grill without having to worry about this stuff, which by the way is only going to happen if me and all my cool friends continue to gain influence and power within American politics, then you're not going to be invited to the barbecue. Like, we need all hands on deck. Being an American doesn't have to be reduced to this like legal abstraction. And if you're right wing, we need you really to just give a damn. Not everything has to be about this. Well, I never consented to having to give a damn. I'm just going to stay inside and play video games and get high and masturbate and eat chips all day. And it's like, it's so tiresome. Like, we just don't have time for that. We will either hang together or we will hang separately. But that aside, this all doesn't mean that individual rights aren't important, that you shouldn't have them. But again, that is only possible if you have God in society, since God is what grants you those things. And God and Christianity are in the same league for what we're talking about here, not liberalism. And we're doing a whole separate thing on just Christianity and conservatism after this video. But for right now, just know this. Liberalism, leftism, it's all about selfishness. Satanism, that whole philosophy, it's the same thing, which we'll get into more in a second. It's about the ultimate prioritization of the self. This is what Lucifer said to God. He said, non-servium, I will not serve. I will not subject myself to your authorities, your objective truth and good. I will prioritize myself over that. And from here, we can see why the leftist view of rights is a positive view of rights, because they're selfish and narcissistic. They believe that they are entitled to things, that they have a right to things that can only be provided to them by the labor of others. That is satanic. The idea that you have rights to things simply because you are so self-important, that's pride. They try to disguise it as altruism or as compassion, but it's not about that. It's about pride. It's about what they want. They don't actually care about the community or the greater good, and when they pretend to, it's only because they want to siphon dopamine from virtue signaling. It's not about helping others. It's about viewing others as your servants because they view themselves as gods. This is why all these celebrities and elites can wear leftist slogans as fashion statements without actually doing anything productive or material to help those in need. It's literally just a fashion statement to these people. They're well off, so now all that's left to do with those phrases is to use them to feel good, basically. Or what about when people make millions of dollars promoting these phrases? Do they donate the money to charity? Do they start cooperatives? Or at least stop paying those who work for them as just contractors and pay them equally to what they're making? No, they buy luxury homes and apartments because it's not actually about people, it's about themselves. Who would have guessed that? Who would have guessed that godless degenerates who spread evil throughout society wouldn't actually care about their fellow man, but would instead exploit them for their own personal benefit under the guise of advocating for their best interest? Me, I would have guessed it because it's a tale as old as time. Now, think of the opposite. The idea of negative rights. It's about sacrifice. Maybe I really hate that guy's opinion, but I'll put up with it because it's his right. Maybe I feel safer without that guy owning a gun, but I'll put up with it because it's his right, etc. It's about sacrificing your subjective, personal desires for the God-given rights of others. And this is akin to Christianity, which is about sacrifice, among other things. It is about subjecting yourself to something greater than yourself, making that sacrifice, serving God, doing his will, doing good. And here's the difference, which sounds counterintuitive, but it is true. The conservative will focus on his community. He will focus on his neighbors, how they're doing, if they need help, his church, etc. As a result, the society is stabilized. It is full of good people. They all trust each other. They have relationships with each other. And resultantly, the individual can exist without anybody really trying to bother him. In contrast, the leftist will put all emphasis on the individual, or in other words, himself, his rights, what he believes that he's entitled to. And he will claim that it's to help out people who are oppressed, to help out the downtrodden in society, but of course it's not. It's simply to help himself. It's not even that their policies don't work and that they're all hypocrites in their personal lives. It's that literally it is about nothing more than the self, self-interest, pure selfishness, narcissism. This is why, as you're probably all recalling right now, that the most narcissistic people you will ever meet in your lives are all leftists, because left-wing thought breeds narcissism. It destroys civilizations, whereas right-wing thought breeds sacrifice, and it builds civilizations. Same thing. Satanism encourages you to follow your desires, and resultantly, it destroys everything that it touches, whereas Christianity encourages you to follow God and to sacrifice your desires in tandem to that. And not coincidentally, the greatest, freest, most prosperous, most moral societies in the history of the world were founded upon Christianity. And as liberalism, aka rationalized Satanism, has usurped that power, the country has completely lost itself. And that's what we took for granted. When the United States was established, the people who settled here had come from those traditions, and I suppose it was just kind of expected that they would sustain themselves. But that just hasn't been the case. Like, the church would sustain itself over time, but that hasn't been the case, unfortunately. And as we're seeing the results of that play out every day in America, we have to think, if America became a Christian country again, the problems would go away to a huge extent. But a lot of people just aren't ready for that because they worship themselves. But they also think that they aren't a part of the problem, because at least they're not as annoying or incessantly dramatic as these college liberals are. Well, I don't like organized religion. I don't like some book telling me that I can't watch pornography and sit around on my ass all day. And they're all hypocrites anyways, these church folk. I want to worship alongside people as perfect as me. And then something about Catholic priests molesting boys, even though it's not at a rate higher than the clergy of any other religion, actually. And even then, I still send my kids to public school, which has a rate of child molestation astronomically higher than the Catholic Church, by the way. But I don't know about that because I just read headlines from mainstream media, which is run by literal Satanists. Not to mention that they're teaching my kids in public schools to hate themselves because they're white, hate their country because it's white, question their gender, etc., etc. And my entire life has actually been a series of concessions and inaction. And I'm totally amoral, but I'll talk your ear off about how the government tried to take my guns. I'd shoot them all. But not because they're the enforcement arm of a state that facilitates the genocide of millions of children every year, or that promotes vice in society to destroy families and communities. I'm not going to do anything about that. I'm just going to watch sports ball. But because if the state takes my guns, then I won't have any guns to talk about using against the state if they ever try to take my guns, which means I won't be able to pretend that I have actually any convictions or principles anymore, which will make me realize that the cost of my perpetual comfort and leisure has been my spine, because I'm a man of yeast. I'm a dough man. I'm a blob. I'm a coward. You're telling me Christians in the Middle East get lined up on their knees to watch dirt in front of them get painted with the faces of the people next to them just to go to church? They're brothers and sisters, but all I have to do to go to church is start getting up a little bit earlier on Sunday morning? Buddy, I won't even get my phone charger. I won't even get my phone charger. Are you kidding me? God made me this way. I love myself. I swear I love myself. That's why I can't get through the day without taking pills and smoking and watching pornography and drinking and consuming half my body weight in sugar. This is the state of the American male. He is pathetic. He is weak. He's androgynous, and he is no better than those who are actively seeking the destruction of our country. He is complicit. It is through his inaction that he is complicit. He is gross. And we all know people like this. Yes, it's sad, it's unfortunate to illustrate, but it's true. Small government was never about giving people the freedom to do whatever they want. Freedom was never about just doing whatever you want or whatever feels good. It was always about getting the power out of the way so that men would be free to raise moral, Christian families in a safe and prosperous society. That was the whole point. That's what the founders wanted. But it's easy to lose sight of that when you simply define freedom as the ability to pursue one's preferred method of self-destruction because you're too distracted by your own vices to realize that they have brainwashed you. Your judgment is too clouded. You are a slave to your own desires. You no longer have what it takes to live in a free, safe, and prosperous society. You don't have the discipline necessary to do that anymore. Freedom requires order. This is not a new idea. Everybody recognized this to be the case until roughly right after World War II. But the reason people think that this isn't the case and that I'm the one who's incorrect is because their entire political and philosophical education was given to them by the same people.
Yeah, no, I do have a theory about how World War II destroyed America. I mean, everyone thinks that it made America, but I think that it actually turned America into the bad guy that it is today.
Who have failed to conserve anything in our country during the same period of time where the most crucial ground was ceded to our enemies. And now, the only reason that those ideas about small government and freedom so I can do whatever I want, the only reason that those can exist online is because the established order, which has total control now, does not view those ideas to be a legitimate challenge to their authority. And that's because they aren't. That concept of the world is not a threat to the established order of things. There's a reason that Donald Trump was kicked off Twitter, but the so radical and extreme, edgy Libertarian Party accounts haven't been. There's a reason that I was kicked off Twitter, but mainstream conservatives who espouse the same talking points haven't been. And it's because they do not exist as a threat to the established order. And they don't even exist as conservatives, frankly. They exist effectively as these like pressure release valves to convince well-meaning patriots that they actually still have some representation left in this country because these publications and these pundits can like go viral on Facebook.com by making fun of AOC or by stating the fact that there are only two genders. And it's like, it's not enough. It will never be enough to look at a tyrannical government that is hostile towards its own people and say, I don't think that you should exist, but I have principles, so I'm not going to do anything to take that power back from you because you could then use that power against me again, and then I'd be back at square one. And I think that this makes sense because my understanding of power is equivalent to that of a child or a woman. And the state basically says, oh, that's cute. It's not a legitimate idea. The only legitimate idea is to declare, I know what is good, and I know that what you are doing is bad. And I'm going to take that power away from you, and I'm going to use it for good. And I'm going to keep bad people from ever obtaining it again by holding on to it with an iron grip. Because I have now learned that the power vacuum is impossible to achieve, and it almost cost me my country to learn that. And maybe it will. That is the general idea that gets people kicked out. That gets people in trouble. If you're only interested in thinking about how we can just possibly return to an earlier stage of liberal decline, then you're not a serious person. If there is to be a future in this country, then it begins by figuring out how to keep people who basically want to like rape and brainwash your kids from ever even approaching a position of public influence or power ever again. And it is completely achievable. Just look at our history. It did not used to be like this. We can get back to that point if we start taking things seriously and stop just like pointing and laughing every time Joe Biden stumbles through a sentence. You can't talk. That's not to say ridicule is not important, by the way. It is, but there's a balance to be achieved between serious and unserious. And whatever we're doing right now clearly is not working, and I think on that at least we can agree. Bruh. John Doyle, stay on topic without berating right-wing weakness challenge. Improbable. It's so true. But anyways, we talked about the conflict of good and evil, about the classification of man as basically good or as flawed, and the implications of all of that politically. And I think the conflict of good versus evil as like the eternal conflict is basically correct. And I think it calls back yet again to our friend to the horseshoe theory of practical intelligence, where less intelligent people will tell you it's all the good guys versus all the bad guys. Then you'd have the average intelligence people, the normies, the midwits, and they tell you, no, it's about competing interests and subjective understandings of morality and precedence and blah, blah, blah. But then you'd have the hyper-intelligent people like, aggression and conflict are not inherently wrong. The side aggressing in accordance with good is correct, and we can always deduce this given that we know right from wrong, etc. So then it's like, okay, how do we know good? Well, because we have the Bible, and it's written on your heart. And I told you I wasn't going to preach to you today, so I won't. However, you should at least understand that everything that's going on in society right now that you think is evil, the Bible also says that it's evil, and the Bible also predicted that all of this would happen. So that might be worth taking into account. So at the very least, we'll talk about how what is evil is what is being pushed by the left, and then in the next video, of course, we'll be talking about the links between specifically Christianity and conservatism. One of those points being that if we are as God made us, then hierarchy is inevitable. What does leftism reject? Hierarchy. And this is why leftism, broadly speaking, is inherently godless and has demonstrably been such throughout history without exception. Like, how can communists slaughter tens of millions of people? Because they're godless. They don't universally value human life. And generally speaking, without God, you cannot be good. You can be incidentally good, but the point is that it should not be surprising that the greatest examples of evil in human history can be shown to have been perpetrated by people who were either godless or who were worshiping demons, including what's going on in our predominant culture right now. So my message to you right now is not that demons are real, not that you need to repent and accept Jesus Christ. Might be a good idea though. I don't know. It's simply that if the Bible were true, and I don't feel as though you're entitled to a spoiler alert because it's been out for a couple thousand years now. You should have read it by now, but spoiler alert, it's true. My point is just to show you how all of the evil that we know is being pushed by the left overlaps almost perfectly with Satanism, which vindicates the Bible. And I have one more thing to tell you about before we really dive into the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. It really is more of a question. Folks, it's getting crazier out there, is it not? And more of you are choosing to exercise your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms with American-made We the People holsters. Those of you who aren't are going to wish that you would listen to me when the consequences of leftism are staring you in the face. But these guys are more than just holsters. They're becoming a destination for patriotic Americans just like yourself. So go to wethepeopleholsters.com/Doyle. Check out their complete line of patriotic shirts. They're 100% American-made tactical gun belt with a proprietary talon buckle. And you might say, well, that sounds great, but it's not like they have their own line of bacon jerky. And even if they did, it's unlikely that it would be flying off the shelves. Well, you look like an idiot right now because the opposite is true. They actually do have their own, and it is actually flying off the shelves. I mean, that is somewhat hyperbolic. You know, they still have like a stock that they can send you. It's not quite yet like in this sort of post-Biden grocery store type situation. I'm just trying to say that it's good. Plus, We the People holsters are custom molded to fit your exact firearm for a quick, smooth draw with thousands of options to choose from. Plus, a selection of custom printed holsters you are sure to find just the right fit for your lifestyle. So go to wethepeopleholsters.com/Doyle. Right now, get an additional $10 off with the offer code Doyle. Every holster with a lifetime guarantee. If it's not a perfect fit, send it back, get a full refund. wethepeopleholsters.com/Doyle. wethepeopleholsters.com/Doyle. Very epic. We are now free to consume the meat and potatoes. There's going to be 4 brackets to this. We're going to talk more specifically about the general overlap between liberalism and Satanism, and then we'll discuss that within the context of the Church of Satan and the Satanic Temple. Then we're going to analyze 2 common cultural practices to better illustrate what we're talking about, which will be drag queen story hour and abortion. Then we'll tie it all together, and then you're out of here. Ready, set, go. Okay. So you ever think about how our society is completely upside down, like everything's inverted, everything is backwards? That is by design. What Satan seeks to do is draw us away from God, and he does this by mobilizing his forces to pervert everything that God created, make it wrong, make it backwards, make it unnatural. So just keep that in mind as we go forward, that ultimately what Satan, who is very clever and very deceptive, wants you to do is turn away from God and essentially sell your soul. He wants you to sacrifice your soul at the altar of wealth, fame, pleasure, whatever. And liberalism as a whole, anything left-wing broadly speaking, views the world through the lens of something called humanism. And that is basically defined as an ideology that places supreme authority in human beings as opposed to nature or God, and its purpose is to further human beings subjectively defined by human beings themselves. And this is, of course, related to these ideas of progressivism and progress, because it's thought that human beings have progressed past the point where we need God, that those ideas are outdated or archaic, and so without God at the top of the hierarchy, we have elevated ourselves to the top of the hierarchy to where now we think that we're gods, that we know what's best, that we can do what we want, we can decide all of this subjectively. There is no good and bad, but now tolerance and intolerance. And this, of course, is completely opposed to Christianity, which is why throughout history you will see that the greatest enemies to Christian societies have always been leftists, socialists, humanists, etc., because they took the golden rule from Christianity, as outlined in Matthew 7, and they reconfigured it to be the elimination of any inequality between human beings, which of course is unnatural and impossible to achieve. This is opposite to Christian and conservative thought, which says that just as we acknowledge that hierarchy is real, that some are better at certain things than others are, we acknowledge that God is bigger than us. He knows what is best. He knows why we are here. Therefore, we submit ourselves to his authority. We make that choice. That's what faith is. We acknowledge that there is right and wrong. And so we try to do everything we can to squash it in our own lives and also in society, because we know that if we allow sin to proliferate within society, then that society will become sick and it will continue to fester and rot, and eventually it will be beyond our control to solve. Now, a common objection to Christian morality is the smugness and sense of moral superiority that we've seen a million times before with Christians, but I would offer a few counterpoints to that. Firstly, pride is a sin, and we're all sinners, and it's unrealistic to want to worship alongside people as without sin as you may think that you are. Secondly, I don't even think that this is a Christian problem. I was thinking about this recently. I think it's just a woman problem. Like, I've never seen this for men at the church. It's always the white women, it's always the black women, and sometimes the Hispanic women, but I would argue that it's much less common. And it's like you look at that same sense of moral superiority when it's not happening in the church, and it's the same people. It's the white liberals, it's the black liberals, etc. It's liberal feminine men and women. So let's be clear, it's not a church problem, it's a woman problem. And the Bible literally tells you about this in the first few pages. It warns you. You read Genesis, you read 1 Timothy, you'll see what I mean. But on that point, that sense of moral superiority that we see so often from people on the left is stemming from pride. And you can tell because it's always delivered with this great degree of smugness. Like, you would never see someone who's actually morally superior be like, sorry, sweetie, murder's wrong, okay? Oh, you poor baby, you never learned that stealing purses from old ladies is wrong? I feel so bad for you, right? Like, that's not what happens. It's always people who are blinded by their pride telling you what is wrong is actually right, which is totally backwards, and they do it so smugly. And pride is satanic because it's leading you towards self-worship and spiritual independence, and the devil laughs while it happens. And I've said before that the vast majority of leftist thought basically exists as a series of rationalizations for why they're addicted to touching their own pee-pee, and I stand by that 100%. And this is a part of that, because so much of what they're saying is just condescending nonsense, which is meant to justify their own vice and sin. They know it's wrong, they feel the guilt, and that makes them anxious, which makes them aggressive, they get defensive. But their weakness also has made them feminine, so that's where the passive aggression comes from. That's where the condescending comes from. The same way that if you criticize an alcoholic, they get defensive and lash out at you. So the point is that if you have a problem with pride and smugness, you have a problem with sin, and with the left. So we're still in the same boat here. And a great political example of the contrast between a godly society and a group of communists using Satan to attack that society, or actually, I should say a group of communists being used by Satan, that would probably be more accurate. But the greatest examples in somewhat recent history, other than of course our own country right now, would be two of the most unfortunate things to ever happen in all time, which were the French and Russian revolutions. And basically what happened is that there was...
I opened it and
Yeah.
his thing popped up and said his name.
Oh.
That was funny. I was like, I have to go tell Chase.
Nice.
He's good at it.
He's good at it?
He keeps playing it every time.
Yeah.
If I play the next game, he'll play again.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It's cool. I was doing good, and then...
Man, this is 3 people against my 1.
Who is that? Who's this person?
This? John Doyle.
Is he real?
Yeah, he's real.
Yeah. Remember that Safeway stuff that they did?
Yeah.
It's like, if you're on Facebook, a play twins you, play
Nice.
poll together.
Nice.
And now he gets up at like 2 or 5:30 sometimes, she said.
Oh, yeah.
Depends what his schedule's gonna be.
Yeah.
I told him I couldn't do it on Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Because it's our holidays we do.
Yep.
family.
Alright, Gabs, I'm gonna get to watching this again.
Okay, I just wanted to tell you that.
Alright.
And the devil laughs while it happens. And I've said before that the vast majority of leftist thought basically exists as a series of rationalizations for why they're addicted to touching their own pee-pee, and I stand by that 100%. And this is a part of that, because so much of what they're saying is just condescending nonsense, which is meant to justify their own vice and sin. They know it's wrong, they feel the guilt, and that makes them anxious, which makes them aggressive, they get defensive. But their weakness also has made them feminine, so that's where the passive aggression comes from. That's where the condescending comes from. The same way that if you criticize an alcoholic, they get defensive and lash out at you. So the point is that if you have a problem with pride and smugness, you have a problem with sin, and with the left. So we're still in the same boat here. And a great political example of the contrast between a godly society and a group of communists using Satan to attack that society, or actually, I should say a group of communists being used by Satan, that would probably be more accurate. But the greatest examples in somewhat recent history, other than of course our own country right now, would be two of the most unfortunate things to ever happen in all time, which were the French and Russian revolutions. And basically what happened is that there was a very influential fellow named
John Milton,
who of course wrote Paradise Lost, and he had unintentionally depicted a version of Satan that ended up being of critical importance in both of those revolutions against strong Christian nations, because it was a depiction of Satan that was perceived to be positive by the people. And if you look at the Church of Reason that was established during—
Yeah, I actually in my book review video or stream, I talked about this.
The French Revolution, it shares the exact tenets of modern-day Satanism, which we'll go over and explain momentarily. But the point is that essentially that depiction of Satan was used by the communists to undermine the strong Christian faith that the populations had, which enabled them to take over. John, elaborate on how exactly the French Revolution was communist. If it took place before the Communist Manifesto was even written, no, but it was actually. And if you had an understanding of history that was more nuanced than just—
People actually do understand that, a lot of the scholars do understand that a lot of the writings from that were like pre-communist writings that basically were communist.
But just keep that in mind as we get into the tenets of modern Satanism. There's sort of this attitude in the culture of, oh, hell is where all the cool people are going to be. Well, sounds like fun. Satan seems pretty chill. You can do whatever you want. But they will find out that such is not the case, and the boys and I will be vindicated once again. But think about that. You can just do whatever you want. When has that ever been a good idea? Have you ever heard the phrase, if it seems too good to be true, then it probably is? The toll will always be paid. What would happen if you let a child simply do whatever he wanted to do? He would eat a bunch of candy and ice cream, and then he would feel very sick afterwards. Now, scale the level of intelligence proportionally. You understand sugar better than like a child might, right? It may get you by, but do you think that your understanding of the world around you is sophisticated enough to where you can simply do as you please and that you will be unfailingly acting in your best interest? Of course not. But this is what Satanism and liberalism tell people. It feels good, just do it, man. Satan wants you to separate yourself from God so that he can have your soul. And the left wants to make you as weak as possible so they can have total control over you. And of course, there's overlap there, but it isn't black and white. The question of whether man is inherently good or inherently bad. Remember earlier we talked about this, and I mentioned that the left thinks that man's nature is basically good, and the right is skeptical of the nature of man, meaning we acknowledge that man's nature is flawed, though he can cultivate virtue if he chooses to do so. This is one of the problems with libertarianism. I just did a debate actually with Austin Peterson on conservatism versus libertarianism, which you can check out on Elijah Schaefer's channel. And he at one point said that people are basically good and can therefore be trusted with total freedom, which adds up given that liberalism and libertarianism are basically cousins. But then later in the debate,
he's being pretty cringe right now, though, on the Palestine versus
the limited power of the state would be that man's nature is either flawed or corruptible, which I tend to agree with, and that would actually be the conservative position. And to that you might say, well, it's power that corrupts man, not freedom. But by definition, freedom is literally power. It's empowerment. But not everyone who's free to purchase a rifle will use it against innocent people, just like not everyone who holds power will use it against innocent people. Our problem is that our system incentivizes the most immoral and corrupt people to seek power. And just like the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, the only thing that can stop a bad guy with power is a good guy with power. But we continue. We talked about how all evil is rooted in self-worship and selfishness. This is true. And you see much of this selfishness masquerading as advocacy for the common good. But of course, this is not the case. This is the left-wing position, and it is perfectly aligned with the doctrines of Satanism because it is rooted in pride, rooted in greed, envy, etc. And the greatest evidence of this, as we discussed, is that these people use these talking points to amass fortunes. And then they keep it all for themselves, and they give none of it to the people for whom they claim to advocate. And this isn't to say that there's something inherently wrong with making a lot of money and then keeping it. However, if you're making that money by claiming to represent people and then you don't actually do it, that is wrong because the product that you're selling them is false hope, even if what they're hoping for is stupid. So the liberal position is essentially this: self-worship masquerading as the common good. They view those around them as cattle to exploit for their own benefit, and they convince them to follow along by claiming that it's actually in their best interest. The right-wing position is exactly opposite, and it aligns quite well with the Christian position, which is sacrificing for the common good to achieve true individual prosperity. Think about it. Making sacrifices, whether that's for your family, for your neighbors, for your community, whatever it may be, those sacrifices will ultimately create a better environment to you or for you to thrive in as an individual. And this is what the Bible calls us to do as well. So the left will pursue this extreme emphasis on what they desire: free healthcare, free college, free money, whatever. They will claim it's to help the downtrodden masses, but ultimately they don't actually care about them. They only care about themselves. Whereas the right will emphasize more on self-sacrifice for the common good because they know that it is like that truly good society that will allow them to prosper as an individual. And that's the difference. The left says, you have to sacrifice for my benefit, and the right says, I will sacrifice for your and my benefit. It is the prioritization of the positive rights, the rights of entitlement, which they believe will benefit them directly because they worship themselves, which is satanic, versus the prioritization of negative rights, which provide the indirect benefit of a better, safer, more prosperous society. We talked about this earlier, but I hope that explanation kind of brings it full circle, that the left-wing position is identical to what the devil wants, which is envy, wrath, pride, and greed, acting as tributary to the individual self-worship. And then the right-wing position, properly defined, would be things like charity, temperance, fortitude, all applied in pursuit of something greater than oneself, which would basically be aligned with what God wants. So there's a couple more things I want to outline here before we dive into the tenets of modern Satanism, and again, why they're perfectly aligned with liberalism, and then we'll illustrate this with things like abortion and drag queens in particular before tying it all together. But there's another distinction between left-wing and right-wing thought that translates well within a biblical context, which is the distinction between temperance and indulgence. Temperance is inherently right-wing, and indulgence is inherently left-wing. Why is temperance inherently right-wing? right wing? Because it implies an order to things that goes beyond the purely carnal desires of the self. To recognize that you could do something, but that you ought not do it. That's an acknowledgement of something greater than yourself, whether that's the future, that's God, whatever it may be. Whereas indulgence is hedonism. Indulgence says if it feels good, do it. You are not bound by anything other than your desires and what you want. Now, maybe what you want is to not indulge, but even that is a little bit different because it still places serving yourself at the top of the pyramid, what you want. Whereas actions of temperance, broadly speaking, tend to place God or family or nation above all else. So it's essentially the difference between do what makes you happy, let people enjoy things, and having discipline. Left-wing thought is rooted in chaos, revolution, femininity, whereas right-wing thought is rooted in order, tradition, and masculinity. So indulgence is left-wing, temperance is right-wing. So what are some examples of indulgence and hedonism? The sexual revolution, promotion of drug use, the body positivity and or fat acceptance movement, etc. What are some examples of temperance? Anything that opposes that, basically. And so this is why there's a war on like vanilla. There's a reason that I said I could talk for 2 hours about how vanilla ice cream is inherently right-wing, which it is. And that is because it is simple. It is natural. The left declares anything vanilla to be boring. And this is because they fried their ability to enjoy things normally, and so they have to take a bunch of extra steps because they couldn't control themselves from the beginning. And this is why they get into these really weird sexual kinks and pretend that everybody else are the weird ones. It's a cope. It is literally just a cope. It's an argument for hedonism. And the reason this is dangerous is because it fits perfectly into that biblical context that we mentioned earlier, because the devil seeks to lead us away from God with earthly pleasures. Look at this thing. It feels good. You should do it, right? Oh, wait, God said you shouldn't? Well, he must not really love you then. And before you know it, after continuously giving into your desires, you will be in a state of despair. And this is something that's important to note. The emphasis on the individual and their ability to do whatever they want as a justification for that will inevitably involve the collective, because as individuals pursue whatever they think will make them happy, they become lost in despair. The actions then must be normalized and promoted in society as a desperate means of potentially alleviating that guilt. Like there's a reason that it was never actually about private individuals in the privacy of their own home, but we bought into that lie regardless. Think about it. You don't know exactly what makes you happy. It's a lot easier to nail down what makes you miserable and avoid doing that instead. And this can be reflected in the data as well. But everyone I know who is enslaved to their vices and who reached that point by initially indulging in their desires, operating under the guise of this feels good, I like this, it makes me happy, they are now the most miserable people. It's a sad thing. There's a reason that the coalition that thinks that human existence can be boiled down to if it feels good, do it, also don't be mean, is more mentally ill than the coalition who thinks it's probably a bit more complicated than that. If you want to see a general prediction of what our country's going to look like if we continue down the path of self-worship, take a look at Australia. I love Australia. I think that they're arguably our greatest ally, if not at least top two. We've got a lot of viewers from Australia. They are very fine people, and they'll probably agree with what I'm about to say. So just know that I mean no disrespect by this, but there is a reason that Australia is experiencing one of the greatest tyrannies that the world has ever seen right now. And that reason is because their country in particular, I believe it's considered to be like the most irreligious country in the world, or at least one of them, but their country has abandoned God in favor of self-worship. And it really is that black and white. Like you either worship God or you worship yourself. Something's going to be at the top of that hierarchy. And if it's not God, it's you. And what happens in that culture that elevates self-worship, that elevates positive rights instead of negative rights, that doesn't worship God? Tyranny and evil. There are two artifacts in particular that were and are foundational to the United States of America and that were not to Australia. And those are very simply Bibles and rifles. And the reason you have a Second Amendment is because it is your God-given right to defend yourself, which is something to which Australia never subscribes. So what happens without the Bible, without an acknowledgement of God-given rights, without a culture that believes in something greater than themselves? They give in to narcissism and fear. And we're right on the way there too. Just look at how the narcissism index has skyrocketed in the last few decades. But think about it. I don't care about your right to defend yourself because I feel scared of guns, and there go the guns. I don't care about your right to like literally go about your life because I feel scared of getting sick. And just like that, tyranny. You cannot escape tyranny in a godless society. You're either living under tyranny or you're on your way there. Because if people don't believe in God, then they fear death. They fear the reality of their own impermanence. They fear what happens after they die. Because of that fear, they cling to life, and they can be so easily manipulated by a state and a state-adjacent media that tells them your life is in danger because of this thing that you otherwise wouldn't have even known about. Whereas religious people know that we win in the end. We know that everything is under control. We do not fear death. Would we prefer to not die? More or less, yeah, but we do not live in fear. This too is why the writers of our Constitution said that this could only function with a religious people and that everything else would not work. That is not vague. That is because tyranny requires fear, and fear requires the absence of God. In other words, as we've said before, keep your Bible and your rifle by your side and you will be okay, big guy. But of course, it's much easier said than done because we'd much rather audaciously deny the will of God to pursue material pleasures. That's why you see all this rhetoric coming from the left about love yourself, accept yourself for who you are, which is always in response to people basically being terrible and degenerate. And it's like, no, to accept yourself for who you are is to recognize that you are a child of God, and your fallen nature manifested as habitual sin is nothing to be praised. The sense of despair that you feel for your lifestyles is not because of people like me. You're not going to convince me for a second that you actually care about the opinions of people like me, but rather it is the inevitable result of living in sin, that sense of despair. And so they have to cope by saying, well, it's because people judge me and make me feel bad for it. We have to normalize it so that it doesn't happen anymore. No, it's because you literally are being lured away from God by demons into this sense of despair. There has never, ever been a story of someone who was a degenerate sinner who opted to live as a devout Christian for 60 days to prove that it's pointless, whose life then did not substantially improve. It doesn't exist. But the pursuit of earthly pleasures prevents most from doing this. And we see this promoted by the left with all of the institutional power that they have. Because the global left is the greatest political force for Satanism in the history of the world, because it simply promotes the doctrines of Satanism without actually mentioning Satan, by employing the greatest trick of them all, simply pretending that the devil doesn't exist. Lucifer wanted to worship himself. Liberalism wants to worship the divine self. Nothing can impose itself on me. Not biology, not language, truth, objective truth, nothing. And of all things in the world, what is liberalism the most preoccupied with? Think about it. Of all things, what can the vast majority of it be traced back to? Sex. We'll talk about why a bit later into this, but there is nothing that makes these people take to the streets like issues pertaining to feminism, pertaining to abortion, etc. Those are all sexual issues. And you might say, well, what about Black Lives Matter? That's different. That's just like black people in general, who, yes, are overwhelmingly liberal, but I'm talking about if you had a sample of 1,000 Democrat voters, the issues that are most likely to get these people into the streets or to get them like melting down on social media are all issues that can be traced back to sex. And this is very simply because sex is the most powerful force of our nature. It's what creates life. It is the ultimate reflection of the natural order, which liberalism and Satanism seek to totally destroy. Think about it. Liberalism has sought to completely invert everything that we understand about sexual behavior. They have inverted what sex is as a bimodal reality, that there are two genders who each have separate biological hardware to facilitate the creation of human life, and that this additionally has implications on everything from their interests and behaviors to their physical statures. They have inverted who sex is for. They have watered down its definition to pretend that what was understood inherently as something that's procreative is now just like a different version of like the spectrum of acts, including when a man masturbates his into another man's that's the same thing fundamentally, just a different type of it, which is what they'll tell you. And of course, they've inverted its purpose in general, why we have sex. Not to create life, you can abort that life if it's inconvenient to you. Not to bond to your wife or to your husband, but simply to feel good as promoted by the sexual revolution, feminism, etc. It is the complete inversion of reality. Why is everything so backwards nowadays? Because that is exactly what both Satanism and liberalism seek to do. And we're going to go over exactly how right now, but I do first have to say that if you want to see more examples beyond what we just mentioned, go watch How the 2010s Changed Politics Forever, and there will be a link to that in the description. Okay, so now we are going to get into the Church of Satan and the Satanic Temple, all that fun stuff. And so the first thing to understand about Satanism is that people who are Satanists are not necessarily actively worshiping Satan, or they don't necessarily believe that he exists. And obviously, this makes no difference to him, since if you practice Satanism, he's going to get your soul when you die, regardless of whether or not you actually believe in him. So he doesn't really care. But the Church of Satan was established under the guise of self-worship, just like we've been talking about earlier. And of course, this recalls the other point that we made, which is that there really is a dichotomous understanding of existence where it is either God or you at the top of the hierarchy. And a rejection of God and or a prioritization of the self are exactly what the devil wants. But of course, he has a silver tongue, and it's much better marketing to tell people, oh, just do what you want, than it would be to tell them to outright reject God, since the latter would set off more red flags probably. But of course, either avenue will still grant him access to your soul in the end, so he doesn't really care. So I'd never actually read, by the way, the 9 statements from the Church of Satan before. This is because, of course, I'm not a godless heathen, but in reading them while outlining this video, I was legitimately surprised at how obvious it is that evil forces are at work. Like, I really thought that it would be more subtle than it is, but it's not. And anyone with a fundamental understanding of Christianity will see what I mean. So we'll go through these one by one and explain why they lead away from God, and also how they're perfectly in alignment with left-wing philosophy. And by the way, if you don't already hate the Antichrist, you definitely will after we're done with this, because he is a sneaky bastard. And as a result of that, Satanism, as a religion, is really like the most powerful religion in the world. And what I mean by that is that it really just has this unrivaled ability to just easily influence the masses, since it is about self-worship, and people are flawed and prideful and narcissistic, and so this appeals to them because we act as animals who basically try to fulfill our most primitive desires. Also, we will give a general summary of each of these as they fit into liberal philosophy, but the greatest proof is to simply ask any left-wing person you know if they disagree with any of these, and none of them would disagree with any of them. So the first one is Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. And we talked about this earlier as it pertains to how the left and the right view this, and how the satanic view is obviously to indulge rather than to abstain, because it exploits our flawed nature to drive us away from God in the pursuit of earthly pleasures, which corrode our spirits. And then, of course, the Christian position is the opposite of this, putting God above all else. But basically, all of these are the Church of Satan trying to appeal to those desires and make everything else seem boring, which echoes one of the realities of existence, which is simply that oftentimes what is good is boring, whether that's responsibility, eating non-poisoned food, etc. So the next one is Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. And what this means is that Satan represents living in the moment, making the most out of these vital moments instead of this unrealistic idea of something happening after we die. And this is, of course, just another argument or justification for hedonism, for living in the eternal present, because as we've discussed, being abstinent or being of temperance requires that you acknowledge something greater than yourself. You are planning for something. You are delaying gratification, etc. This is what builds families, builds nations, communities, and also what enables them to be moral, prosperous, and free. And so naturally, liberalism and Satanism would seek to erode that, because liberal philosophy has always rejected the concepts of delayed gratification, because that requires that the individual is to be subject to the constraints of the future, which do not necessarily affect them immediately. It has always been about the complete and total freedom to exist in the state of the eternal present. And Satanism would, of course, advocate for this as well, since Satan must convince you that there is no afterlife. There's nothing after this. You're going to die, and then when you die, it's over. So you may as well just do whatever you want while you're here. And it's not like you're going to be held accountable for this or anything. That's just a pipe dream, which is exactly what he wants you to believe, so that he can steal your soul for eternity. And by the way, a lot of you might be skeptical when I say that, but if I'm wrong, it just means that I didn't get to take advantage of girls with low self-esteem or do drugs or whatever. Whereas if you're wrong, you're literally going to have your soul ripped from your body and yeeted into hellfire for eternity. Anyways, we continue. The next one is Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. The point of this one is to allude to being able to rationalize logically your own desires, which is why they say undefiled wisdom. They're basically saying, oh, religion? That's been debunked. That's not wisdom. That's defiled. We know better now. And this is exactly what liberalism seeks to do as well. Liberalism seeks to define truth by what the science says. But the science is sponsored and conducted by the regime, which also censors anything that threatens it. The studies that have been conducted which actually prove that sin leads to despair, those aren't a part of the mainstream conversation. What occupies the mainstream conversation are studies and experts who claim that all of these things are normal and healthy, actually. And that is because the regime is not threatened by a population in despair who don't know God. The only thing that threatens their power over you is a class of people who are not in despair and who know God and who do not fear death. Or them. It's a strategy. It's easy to prove that killing people is harmful, but it's not as easy to prove that casual sex is harmful, though both are true. And like we said, the devil doesn't care either way as long as he gets your soul. So the strategy is to feign morality by saying, well, don't harm people, which connotes anti-violence sentiment. But of course, you can harm people without committing violence against them. But the point is that this is all to allude to this idea of, oh yeah, those social conventions, well, they were never based on anything real. No, that was just all people wanting to control you for no reason. Just do what makes you happy. And of course, this is coming from the coalition of people that use their power to usher in the greatest tyranny that the globe has ever seen over the course of the last 2 years, except for maybe 2 examples from the 20th century. It's an exploitation of man's pride. Oh, well, God said don't do this. Well, don't you worry. We know better now. We're wiser. And the other half of it hits the buzzword. It talks about hypocrisy, because one of the biggest criticisms of Christianity from a-religious people has always been hypocrisy, which is fair enough. We talked about this earlier. But hypocrisy is not an argument against Christianity. It's actually an argument for it, because it concedes that human nature is flawed and that we all fall short of the glory of God. And the anti-Christian argument has always been, well, maybe if we can't meet the standards, then the standards don't or shouldn't exist. This is stupid. It is objectively true that a world without sin would be perfect, and to argue otherwise is just dishonest. The reason we can't achieve this isn't because the standards don't actually exist, but because of our nature. So given that, it would be better to acknowledge that and strive to be better instead of basically like pouting over it and giving up. Hypocritical self-deceit. What they're saying is the standards aren't true, and even if they were, people can't meet them. It's not self-deceit, as we just said, but it's also not hypocritical. It's not hypocritical to declare that sin is wrong and then to sin through a moment of weakness and then repent for that sin. Hypocrisy would be saying, well, sin's wrong, and then just going about sinning without any repentance or prayer. It's not hypocritical to know and declare that sin is wrong and then to sin because you're just weak. Like, God knows that. He will forgive you for that if you repent. But you have to humble yourself before him to do that, which unfortunately many people just don't want to do because of their pride. So Satan likes this because it rejects the concept of sin in favor of whatever the regime experts say, which will grant him your soul. And the left likes this because it allows them to continue to live in the eternal present while criticizing those who dissent by claiming that they're hypocrites. We continue. The next one is Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. This one is particularly sneaky because it uses the word kindness for those who deserve it. And it says not to waste love on ingrates. The Bible teaches to
kindness is
love God above all else, but below that, to love one another. Being kind to someone, though, is much different than loving them, because if you love...
Yeah, loving someone would be telling someone that they're doing wrong, even when it might hurt their feelings. Being kind to someone would be like just not...
someone, it suggests that you seek to do whatever is objectively in their best interest, or at the very least will avoid doing things that are bad for them. Kindness is different. It's not being good. It's not doing good. It's just being kind. And only to those who deserve it, as defined by literal Satanists. And also not wasting love on people who they described as ingrates. This is directly in contrast, of course, with the Christian understanding and also the right-wing understanding, because Christians acknowledge the universal value of human life, and conservatives do as well, as indicated by their staunch advocacy for things like the right to life and the right to bear arms, which both presuppose that human life is universally valuable and therefore worth preserving, whereas the left perceives life to be basically of conditional value, meaning the value of the life is defined by how convenient it is to whoever has more power. A mother can kill a child if it's inconvenient to her. A communist dictator can kill his political opposition because they are inconvenient to him, etc. And so these are both things that are openly celebrated by the left. And of course, Satanism fundamentally rejects the value of human life as something universally, or I should say uniquely special. So this one is basically saying that you should only be kind to people who deserve it, which ostensibly means other Satanists, or people who at least aren't convicted enough to object to the widespread promotion of sin. And then it says also that you shouldn't love anyone who isn't a part of that thinking because they're ingrates, they're lesser than, etc. You can be kind to someone and still exploit them, though, to get what you want. But that doesn't mean that you're actually doing something good for them as though you love them. For example, Satan is very kind when he grants you fame and fortune, but it's only because he wants your soul in exchange. And the same goes for all of these vices. And this fits perfectly within the liberal worldview, which abandons right and wrong in favor of tolerance and intolerance. And the people who are intolerant are therefore immoral and don't deserve respect or even acknowledgement or a presence in society. And the next one is Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. This is obviously in contrast to the Christian teaching, as it even mentions, and that's because anger and grudges are like a poison. They're very bad for you. It's better to be free from those energies. But Satanism would prefer that you give into those desires that allow for the anger to fester inside of you, that you become this like bitter, hateful person, etc. And of course, the left are mostly bitter, resentful, mentally ill people who would have no problem enacting mass revenge on those who they perceive to be a threat to their utopian, egalitarian society under the guise of, it's called accountability. It's called, don't be an asshole. You're mean. It really is that simple. So the next one is Satan represents responsibility to the responsible instead of concern for psychic vampires. And this is just another way of saying that you only have to care about people who are non-threatening to your worldview and to your desires, even if the only capacity in which they're a threat is through judgment or advocacy against it. They don't matter. They're actually a psychic vampire or whatever. Satan likes this because it rejects that we are called to care for our neighbors. And the left likes it because it justifies their ingrained selfishness. They weren't going to care about their neighbors anyways, but it's better for them if they can pretend that it's because they didn't like display a hate has no home here sign on their front lawn. We continue. Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, more often worse than those who walk on all fours, who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. And again, this is alluding to this idea of wrong being synonymous with violence, and therefore because the heckin' animal arenos don't murder people like people do, they're better than us. No, they're not. I'm still team human. The reason Satanists promote this idea is because it rejects the idea that human beings are special and that God made us in his image, which calls into question the universality of human value. Since if we're just like animals and we kill animals, we must not be that special either, right? And the left likes this because they're very feminine and they simp for animals, and it's also very easy to implement very severe regulations in society under the guise of, no, we must help the animals, save the trees. Shut up, hippie. Animals like dying. Ah, yes, a soldier's death. Thank you, kind hunter. Quote, every animal ever. A cow that is slaughtered and eaten has lived a more meaningful life than the average mid-30s man who just watches Marvel movies and works in HR. It's true. Also, these man-animal themes will come up later as we discuss the relationship between drag queens and demons, but we continue. Satan represents all the so-called sins, as they all lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. This is very misleading. It's actually dangerous. Gratification is much different than happiness or even contentment. It is true that you will feel gratification or pleasure when you sin, but after that fades away, which it always will, it will leave you feeling in a state of despair. Maybe not a lot, but as you continue down the path, it gets worse, and then you continue sinning, trying to numb that feeling with the continued indulgence and pleasures. It's a very bad cycle. So yeah, Satan is literally saying here, I like sins because they feel good. It feels good, so you should do it, which of course is akin to the effective motto of the left, which is also, if it feels good, do it. And it has been forever. Just like in the Garden of Eden, Satan is luring you away from God with a promise of gratification, and it's just like in Genesis. It's the feminine energy that is the most susceptible to this. Women and weak men, the literal coalition of the global left. Anyways, last one. Satan has always been the best friend the church has ever had. He's kept it in business all these years. No, he hasn't, you idiot. The church is still in business in spite of Satan, not because of him. He's not a friend. We hate the Antichrist. But Satanists like this idea because it gets back to their very vague narrative of Christianity just trying to like control people for no reason, and they'd much rather have people descend into a perpetual state of sin. And I can't say that the left really aligns with this, but you definitely see traces of it within their whole brand of like this smug George Carlin-esque cynicism. Very cringe. But the point of all this is that there is no real difference, and there is no practical difference between atheism, Satanism, and liberalism, because they're all effectively a rejection of God in favor of worship of the self. And there really is no real or effective difference between the goals of Satanism or the goals of liberalism. As we discussed, they are the same in practice. They are naturalist ideas. Socialism, leftism, atheism, Satanism, they are all apples from the same perverted tree. Literally just look at the Satanic Creed. Do what thou wilt. What is the translation of this in modern politics? Shh, let people enjoy things. That's literally the Reddit version of the Satanic Creed. They're all the same idea. They're the same in practice, and they serve the same master, but it's not God, and it's not even yourself, even though you're made to believe that it is. It's actually Satan. So those are the 9 Satanic statements. Now I will go over the 7 tenets of the Satanic Temple in the same format because, believe it or not, the Satanic Temple is actually more influential and deceptive than the Church of Satan. So we'll do that now. And all of these as well perfectly aligned with the tenets of liberalism, as we will explain. So the first one is, one should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. This is, of course, a key tenet of utilitarianism, which is closely related to liberalism and often develops alongside liberal philosophy, because both emphasize compassion to the entire society, regardless of the situation. But it has to be in accordance with their subjectively defined reason, which is usually going to be whatever the narratives of the regime are. And so resultantly, we see people not being held accountable, claiming that it's because of their environment, it's because of socioeconomic factors. Well, they were just born like this, etc. However, if anybody dares to challenge the amoral vacuum by asserting that right and wrong do exist, then they are to be shut down because they actually pose a threat to the established order. Also, their use of the word creatures, very cringe. It's the same thing that we mentioned earlier. It's elevating animal lives to the value of human lives, to reject the concept of universal human value and the fact that we are made in the image of God. And of course, Satan likes this because it maintains the amoral power vacuum, which he can fill, and it denies the relationship between man and God by adding the creatures and the within reason clauses. So we continue. The second one is, the struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. And again, this is all within the context of how they define reason, which means that social justice takes precedence over laws and institutions. And now you wonder why they went after Kyle so intensely, why the regime doesn't prosecute, let alone even track leftist violence. What's going to happen to you as someone who exists outside of the radius of their compassion and whose life can no longer be protected by the laws which are deemed irrelevant to the mob rule? Not good. So the left likes this because it justifies their suppression of any opposition to them, and Satan likes this because he masquerades his intentions with vague moral narratives to capture the energy of the masses and use it to do his bidding. Great example, the social justice of women's rights, something that compels millions of people to take to the streets every year, millions of mothers to take to the streets, and the end result is the slaughtering of millions of unborn children, all under the guise of justice. And we will be talking extensively about abortion in a moment, but let us continue. The next one is, one's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. Yes, the divine will of the individual. Nice try, Satan. We've been covering this for years, and we think it's dumb. The point being that nobody, this is like a needle in a haystack. No, actually, a Trojan horse is better, because no one actually thinks that this is some like bold statement against slavery or against like forced organ transplants or something like that. That's not what it's intended to be, even if that's what it claims. What this is really trying to do is justify abortion under the guise of bodily autonomy or whatever. So as we know, the idea of freedoms and rights stems from liberalism, with Satanism and leftism taking the view of positive rights, which means they believe that they have a right to an abortion because it's their own body, and the rights of the baby are second to the rights of the woman, and that another person cannot control their body even if to protect the life of the child. So again, the whole point of this is to advocate for the genocide of unborn children, which of course the left wants, since abortion is the ultimate achievement of liberal philosophy, which we'll explain. And of course, Satan likes this because he likes child sacrifice and the shedding of innocent blood, and he doesn't have the power to kill your child. So instead, he whispers into your ear so that you do it instead, and then he takes your soul in the process. Scary stuff. Yet we continue because we fear no evil. So the next one, the freedoms of others should be respected, including a freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. Now this one actually sounds like it might be good. Well, to be fair, they all sound good on paper. But remember, when they're talking about rights and freedoms, they're not talking about your God-given rights. They reject those. Remember, they're talking about rights and freedoms within the context of social justice and what they define to be reasonable. And since you exist outside of that context, because of what you believe, you are not extended any compassion or respect. Do you really think that when they say freedom to offend, they're talking about, well, facts don't care about your feelings, gang? No, no. You would not have the freedom to offend them by dissenting against the narratives of social justice. That rule is written for them and not for you. Think about it. When this was written, they were trying to take control of the culture, a culture that was predominantly Christian. So what do? They usher in all of their vulgarity and blasphemy and degeneracy under the guise of having freedom of expression and freedom of speech and the freedom to offend. And Americans were stupid and just accepted that. And look where that got us. So like all of this, the left likes it because it justifies their attacks against dissent without requiring that they put up with the same from their opposition. And Satan likes it because it enables his forces to basically Trojan horse depraved content into a formally polite and relatively moral society. So the next one, beliefs should conform to the best scientific understanding that one has of the world. One should take care to never distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. This is a great one because they control academia. So anything that is in alignment with their narrative is what the science says. It's the expert consensus or whatever. But also, when challenging things that have been acknowledged as true for generations, then they employ this idea of relative truth. Well, that's your truth. What about my truth? And that's the cycle. Promote relativism, wait for the truth to become vulnerable, take power, and then declare your ideology to be the truth, and then silence anything that challenges it under the guise of misinformation or conspiracy theories. Once again, it's a Trojan horse because you get the masses to accept that science is the arbiter of truth. Then you simply get science to define what was formerly known to be bad as natural and good and healthy, actually. And the left likes this because it justifies their control over the narratives and the flow of information. And Satan likes it because it rationalizes bad to such an extent that the masses are convinced that it's good, actually. But the next one is, people are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused. Remember, like they said, these rules only apply to you. They're not talking about damage to communities during riots for social justice. That's all justified. It's more like, you misgendered your niece and you have to apologize for it. But it's okay. Hey, no one's perfect. And it's like, yeah, but not because we're not buying into gender theory. It's the same thing. Eternal tolerance for me, but not for thee. Because our do what thou wilt. What is the translation of this in modern politics? Shh, let people enjoy things. That's literally the old people for no reason, and they'd much rather have people descend into a perpetual state of sin. And I can't say that the left really aligns with this, but you definitely see traces of it within their whole brand of like this smug George Carlin-esque cynicism. Very cringe. But the point of all this is that there is no real difference, and there is no practical difference between atheism, Satanism, and liberalism, because they're all effectively a rejection of God in favor of worship of the self. And there really is no real or effective difference between the goals of Satanism or the goals of liberalism. As we discussed, they are the same in practice. They are naturalist ideas. Socialism, leftism, atheism, Satanism, they are all apples from the same perverted tree. Literally just look at the Satanic Creed. Do what thou wilt. What is the translation of this in modern politics? Shh, let people enjoy things. That's literally the Reddit version of the Satanic Creed. They are all the same idea. They are the same in practice, and they serve the same master, but it's not God, and it's not even yourself, even though your mates believe that it is. It's actually Satan. So those are the 9 satanic statements. Now I will go over the 7 tenets of the Satanic Temple in the same format, because believe it or not, the Satanic Temple is actually more influential and deceptive than the Church of Satan. So we'll do that now. And all of these as well perfectly align with the tenets of liberalism, as we will explain. So the first one is, one should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. This is, of course, a key tenet of utilitarianism, which is closely related to liberalism and often develops alongside liberal philosophy, because both emphasize compassion to the entire society, regardless of the situation. But it has to be in accordance with their subjectively defined reason, which is usually going to be whatever the narratives of the regime are. And so resultantly, we see people not being held accountable, claiming that it's because of their environment, it's because of socioeconomic factors. Well, they were just born like this, etc. However, if anybody dares to challenge the amoral vacuum by asserting that right and wrong do exist, then they are to be shut down, because they actually pose a threat to the established order. Also, their use of the word creatures, very cringe. It's the same thing that we mentioned earlier. It's elevating animal lives to the value of human lives, to reject the concept of universal human value and the fact that we are made in the image of God. And of course, Satan likes this because it maintains the amoral power vacuum, which he can fill, and it denies the relationship between man and God by adding the creatures and the within reason clauses. So we continue. The second one is, the struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. And again, this is all within the context of how they define reason, which means that social justice takes precedence over laws and institutions. And now you wonder why they went after Kyle so intensely, why the regime doesn't prosecute, let alone even track leftist violence. What's going to happen to you as someone who exists outside of the radius of their compassion and whose life can no longer be protected by the laws which are deemed irrelevant to the mob rule? Not good. So the left likes this because it justifies their suppression of any opposition to them, and Satan likes this because he masquerades his intentions with vague moral narratives to capture the energy of the masses and use it to do his bidding. Great example, the social justice of women's rights, something that compels millions of people to take to the streets every year, millions of mothers to take to the streets, and the end result is the slaughtering of millions of unborn children, all under the guise of justice. And we will be talking extensively about abortion in a moment, but let us continue. The next one is, one's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. Ah, yes, the divine will of the individual. Nice try, Satan. We've been covering this for years, and we think it's dumb. The point being that nobody, this is like a needle in a haystack. No, actually, a Trojan horse is better. To take to the streets, and the end result is the slaughtering of millions of unborn children, all under the guise of justice. And we will be talking extensively about abortion in a moment, but let us continue. The next one is, one's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. Ah, yes, the divine will of the individual. Nice try, Satan. We've been covering this for years, and we think it's dumb. The point being that nobody, this is like a needle in a haystack. No, actually, a Trojan horse is better, because no one actually thinks that this is some like bold statement against slavery or against like forced organ transplants or something like that. That's not what it's intended to be, even if that's what it claims. What this is really trying to do is justify abortion under the guise of bodily autonomy or whatever. So, as we know, the idea of freedoms and rights stems from liberalism, with Satanism and leftism taking the view of positive rights, which means they believe that they have a right to an abortion because it's their own body, and the rights of the baby are second to the rights of the woman, and that another person cannot control their body even if to protect the life of the child. So again, the whole point of this is to advocate for the genocide of unborn children, which of course the left wants, since abortion is the ultimate achievement of liberal philosophy, which we'll explain. And of course, Satan likes this because he likes child sacrifice and the shedding of innocent blood, and he doesn't have the power to kill your child. So instead, he whispers into your ear so that you do it instead, and then he takes your soul in the process. Scary stuff. Yet we continue because we fear no evil. So the next one, the freedoms of others should be respected, including a freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. Now this one actually sounds like it might be good. Well, to be fair, they all sound good on paper. But remember, when they're talking about rights and freedoms, they're not talking about your God-given rights. They reject those. Remember, they're talking about rights and freedoms within the context of social justice and what they define to be reasonable. And since you exist outside of that context, because of what you believe, you are not extended any compassion or respect. Do you really think that when they say freedom to offend, they're talking about, well, facts don't care about your feelings, gang? No, no. You would not have the freedom to offend them by dissenting against the narratives of social justice. That rule is written for them and not for you. Think about it. When this was written, they were trying to take control of the culture, a culture that was predominantly Christian. So what do? They usher in all of their vulgarity and blasphemy and degeneracy under the guise of having freedom of expression and freedom of speech and the freedom to offend. And Americans were stupid and just accepted that. And look where that got us. So like all of this, the left likes it because it justifies their attacks against dissent without requiring that they put up with the same from their opposition. And Satan likes it because it enables his forces to basically Trojan horse depraved content into a formally polite and relatively moral society. So the next one, beliefs should conform to the best scientific understanding that one has of the world. One should take care to never distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. This is a great one because they control academia. So anything that is in alignment with their narrative is what the science says. It's the expert consensus or whatever. But also, when challenging things that have been acknowledged as true for generations, then they employ this idea of relative truth. Well, that's your truth. What about my truth? And that's the cycle. Promote relativism, wait for the truth to become vulnerable, take power, and then declare your ideology to be the truth, and then silence anything that challenges it under the guise of misinformation or conspiracy theories. Once again, it's a Trojan horse because you get the masses to accept that science is the arbiter of truth. Then you simply get science to define what was formerly known to be bad as natural and good and healthy, actually. And the left likes this because it justifies their control over the narratives and the flow of information. And Satan likes it because it rationalizes bad to such such an extent that the masses are convinced that it's good, actually. But the next one is, people are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused. Remember, like they said, these rules only apply to you. They're not talking about damage to communities during riots for social justice. That's all justified. It's more like, you misgendered your niece and you have to apologize for it. But it's okay. Hey, no one's perfect. And it's like, yeah, but not because we're not buying into gender theory. It's the same thing. Eternal tolerance for me, but not for thee, because our ideas actually challenge the established order. So the left likes this because it justifies their self-perceived moral authority over the dissenting voices in society, which are me and you and your racist uncle. Happy Thanksgiving, big guy. Give him hell. Don't let him break you. But of course, Satan likes this too because it's the same idea of this vague appeal to a moral framework that will actually be used to usher in widespread immorality and sin. So yeah, here's the last one. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should prevail always over the written or spoken word, which of course means compassion only for those in agreement with the narratives, wisdom as defined by the information used to compose the narratives, and justice as defined by the purported purposes of the narratives. It really is also tiresome. And it's also an attack on Christianity as a whole, as implied by written or spoken word being second to compassion as defined by tolerance and absolvement from responsibility, wisdom as defined by subsidized knowledge, which seeks to undermine traditional morality, and justice as defined by what is subjectively right being executed, which is of course the triumph of immorality. Remember the beginning, the Paul Harvey monologue, If I Were the Devil? There is a reason that everything satanic in society is being promoted by the left, either directly or by proxy. Lust, gluttony, hedonism, envy, wrath. It's all there. And we just illustrated the philosophical overlap as to why this is the case. So now I want to talk about two examples that illustrate this especially well. And those are drag queens and abortion. For drag queens and everyone's favorite drag queen story hour, let's start by defining it. So basically drag as defined by tolerance and absolvement from responsibility, wisdom as defined by subsidized knowledge, which seeks to undermine traditional morality, and justice as defined by what is subjectively right being executed, which is of course the triumph of immorality. Remember the beginning, the Paul Harvey monologue, If I Were the Devil? There is a reason that everything satanic in society is being promoted by the left, either directly or by proxy. Lust, gluttony, hedonism, envy, wrath. It's all there. And we just illustrated the philosophical overlap as to why this is the case. So now I want to talk about two examples that illustrate this especially well. And those are drag queens and abortion. For drag queens and everyone's favorite drag queen story hour, let's start by defining it. So basically drag or drag queens is where men dress up like women, usually for purposes of entertainment. But you can do a lot of things for entertainment. The reason that they settle with this is because it's basically like a gay fetish. And they don't really deny this either, but it's worth mentioning here because drag is also more or less a satanic ritual. And what I mean by this is that, first of all, you can just look at them, try to tell me that they look normal and healthy. But what drag is basically this like performative caricature of what it means to be a woman, which is significantly more offensive, by the way, than blackface. But no one will talk about this. Like when someone does blackface, it's like, haha, my skin dark. Now I'm a black person. Okay, but when someone does drag, they are essentially taking what it means to be a woman and reducing it to like this gay performative fetish defined by a caricature. And this is bad because, believe it or not, being a woman is a more significant identity than just being black, because women can create life. But these people seek to totally invert reality. Like there is a reason that they, as gay men, want to parade around in women's clothing and makeup because they are mocking the natural order of human sexuality and existence. They are essentially taking womanhood and mocking it for their sexual fetishes. No, it's for entertainment. No one who's not a pervert would find this entertaining, dummy. There's a reason that drag is celebrated and promoted to children, but blackface is literally the worst thing that someone can do. I'll give you an example. The most famous drag queen is a character who goes by the name RuPaul. This person has had TV shows. He's been in the international spotlight for a while now. And after President Trump beat Hillary Clinton in 2016, this guy said, the America that we've all fought so hard for, the narrative of love and peace and liberty and equality, it feels like it's dead. Spoken like a true liberal, right? He's also admitted that drag is a very, very political act because it, quotes, challenges the status quo by rejecting fixed identities. And he said that drag says, I'm a shapeshifter. I do whatever the hell I want at any given time, which echoes everything that we've been talking about with liberalism and Satanism, that these people are rejecting the boundaries of reality in favor of their own subjective desires and identities. But it's not enough that they do it. Society must accept them. Your children must learn about it. And it really isn't rocket science. It actually is pretty simple. It's just that they literally want your kids. That's what it's always been. Different degrees of child sacrifice. And everybody knows that children are the easiest to deceive. And when a child is shown these things, they're all dressed up with flashy colors and rainbows and fun music. They're dancing. They're viewing a lifestyle that is devoid of God, but it's painted in fun and these nice ideas of love and tolerance or whatever. It's teaching children not to accept God, but to view themselves as gods. To love and accept yourself means to reject the idea that you are flawed, which is to reject God's truth. This is why we are reminded incessantly that we must lift up gay voices, because they desire to be worshipped as how they see themselves, gods. I am who I say I am, not who God says. I do what I want to do, not what God wants for me. And I love and accept myself, which is to say that I worship myself. There is a reason that these things are installed into the mainstream. No one was ever sitting at home and thought, you know what, we need more shows about drag queens. No, there is a reason that these things are targeting children with your tax dollars, and there's a reason that they are literally dressing up like demons when they do it. There are demons which are androgynous, they're hybrid, they're a male with breasts and the head of a goat, and the American man is just too busy being distracted by the NFL to do anything about this. Why would he? He hasn't done anything about abortion either, which is significantly worse and which has been a part of the mainstream conversation for a significantly longer period of time. It has reached the part of the monologue, ladies and gentlemen, where we discuss abortion, which is not coincidentally both the greatest achievement in the history of liberalism and the greatest achievement for the devil in the history of American society, which is of course why the Satanic Temple was allied with the leftist organizations in pushing back against the Texas anti-abortion laws, which were what inspired this video in the first place a few months ago. So the notes here basically say that abortion is evil, true. Abortion is a satanic ritual, child sacrifice, true. Not only is it killing children, but it's having the mother do it herself. It's having the mother sacrifice the child at the altar of self-worship or of material gains by enabling her easier access to a career or whatever. And of course, Satan is very deceptive. His rhetoric, his strategies, all very appealing. It's like we mentioned earlier. It's about justice and rights and freedom. But in actuality, when you cut through all the noise, when you cut through all the women's rights, my body, my choice, the pink hats, the Amy Schumers, what you'll find are the corpses of 50 million dead children. Think about that, 50 million dead children. Your son or daughter, dead, but virtually millions of times over. 50 million dead children. Where's their pile of shoes? It's the ultimate achievement of liberalism and Satanism. There's no issue, not gay rights, not even racial equality, that will get these people to take the streets and melt down like their ability to legally murder children. You can be a liberal and be pro-gun, be pro-market, a host of other things, they'll basically leave you alone. But you cannot be a liberal and not support abortion. They will attack you like a school of piranhas. And just like you cannot be a liberal and not support abortion, because it's the defining issue of their philosophy, you cannot be a moral person and support abortion. Your morality is not compartmentalized. It's not like you could be a good person here, but then over here, not so much. It's all connected. It is all part of the same soul. It's a part of who you are. And if you don't draw the line at the murder of unborn children, I can only assume that any other line you draw is fake and arbitrary and weak. And the reason that abortion is the defining issue of liberalism, why it's the crown jewel of the whole philosophy, is that it has liberated the individual from the greatest and most obvious constraint that could exist, which is the obligation to another life which they've created. To achieve such a degree of freedom and autonomy that you could have sex, create a life, and then kill that life is the ultimate form of liberalism. There will be more variations and new variations, I'm sure, but nothing will ever surpass that, at least until like transhumanism really takes root. But I don't know. It's playing God. Liberalism, taken to its logical conclusion, is the rejection of God. It puts man above all else. And if man is God, then the value of human life is determined by those around it. This is why mothers murder their children. It's why communists have killed tens of millions of people, particularly Christians in Soviet Russia, and it's why they want to kill even more Christians now. Wait a minute. You're telling me, after explaining the undismissible overlap between Satanism and liberalism, that one of the first things the communists did when taking over an Orthodox Christian country in the 1900s is to start slaughtering Christians like cattle? Yeah, that would add up, wouldn't it? But you didn't learn that in the textbooks because they were written by communists. This gets back to one of the points that we talked about recently, which is that the struggle against communism was not about and is not about economics. It's about the soul of the nation. The communists were and are godless, and we recognize that. People were not starving to death and being executed just because they couldn't get the math right for making sure everyone had enough grain. No, it was largely because they wanted to slaughter them, because they hated them. Never forget that. It's not an economic argument. It is a moral argument and a theological argument. I don't hate communism because it means I can't get products as easily, and they couldn't quite get the math right. I hate it because it wants to kill me for pledging allegiance to God instead of man or to the state. Oh, well, how do we change their minds? We can't. Don't you understand that? You will never debate these people into halting their pursuit of evil and then joining your side with the same passion. It's just not possible. And this, of course, gets into the Chad hominem, because at a certain point, you just have to set facts aside and ask, what happened to you that made you like this? Why are you willing to defend abortion and ignore the facts so passionately? Are you possessed by a demon? It's not even logical, let alone moral. I have a right to an abortion because I want one. I want abortion because it's what I want. It's a tautology. It's circular reasoning. It's not actually saying anything. And they can't say anything because if they just admitted that they wanted to kill children, that wouldn't be so good for PR. And according to the Bible, there's usually like 4 things that become widespread in a society before God goes ahead and deletes it. And those are sexual immorality, child sacrifice, homosexuality, and bestiality. We currently check 3 boxes. And the furries are going to be reaching for the Sharpie pretty soon. And frankly, we deserve whatever happens next. What is the left promoting in society? They control the culture and the power. And what has been the results? We have taken everything that is good and righteous and pure and beautiful, and we have mocked it. And we have instead elevated everything that is evil and disgusting to the core of our society. Our culture has become an abomination. Abortion, materialism, greed, hedonism, gluttony, lust, convenience, endless entertainment. All of that has distracted us from the most important truth. God will not be mocked. And you can roll your eyes. You can keep your pride. Keep recycling to yourself the same tired George Carlin monologues. Ha, I prayed to Joe Pesci. Guess where that got me? Or your little excerpts from your Richard Dawkins book, which you only read half of. None of that will matter because you will bow and you will confess just like everybody else. And you will be humbled to learn that a life dedicated to the pursuit of the self does not make you more than the dust at his feet. Where did we start to go wrong? Maybe not exactly here with abortion. Feminism probably is the problem. Actually, I amend that. No, with society, feminism is the problem, not just here. There's a reason that Milo used to say that feminism is cancer. It doesn't stop. Feminism is just a form of Satanism when you think about it, because it promotes the idea that the sexes are equal when they're not. They were never intended to be. Feminism is unnatural. It's the complete inversion of reality. And in order to achieve something close to an equal outcome, women now have to be elevated above men in society, which is satanic and unnatural. Women above men is chaotic and wrong. Men are leaders. Granted, I can't say I blame women because men have become so weak, so really this is more of an indictment of men than it is women, but the point still stands. Feminism led to abortion, which strips away women from the defining feature of her womanhood. It celebrates this as though it is a victory. They wear it like it's some kind of prize. What feminism promotes as the child of liberalism is the rejection of children, the rejection of nature, the rejection of God. No, I will not serve. Non-servium, exactly as Lucifer said to God, I will not serve. Well, the thing is, it's not actually your body, and it's not actually your choice. This gets into some kind of like metaphysical questions, but it's like, how is it your body? Because you're in possession of it? Because you control it? Yeah, possession's 9/10 of the law or whatever, but just because you have something doesn't make it yours. You didn't make it, you didn't design it, you didn't even want it. That you are blessed with it is like incidental at worst, God's will at best. It's not your choice, it's God's choice, and you are not God. It's about rejecting the order of things. There's a reason that demons are androgynous. There's a reason that abortion sacrifices both masculinity and femininity. Women do not bear and nurture their children, they kill them. Men do not protect their children, they kill them. They just allow it to happen. Well, I just wasn't ready to be a mom. You're still a mom. Now you're just the mother of a dead child, which, if I'm correct, makes you a terrible mother. Actually, the worst mother. You are now in the worst category of mothers. Congratulations. I hope your social science degree that cost $150,000 but paid you $35,000 a year was worth it. You're not your social science degree. Abortion seeks to make us gods, but we're not gods. So instead, it drives us away from gods, which makes us nothing. And when we are nothing, we are meaningless, we are in despair, and of course, abortion is the single most important sacrament of feminism, as it ensures that there can never be consequences for sexual decisions. It is the complete inversion of reality. It is the ultimate pillar of liberalism and Satanism, because it has led to the normalization of widespread child sacrifice in this country. And as we've talked about extensively now, liberalism properly understood is the political arm of Satan. Any society that embraces liberalism will decay into evil and despair. It is inevitable. If you don't understand why, watch again. You cannot reject God, and you cannot pretend that good and evil are just different points of view, because if you do that, your society is going to reflect that. And I think I've shown that this is more or less where we are now. So I'm going to tell you to watch the 2010s video again, because I think it goes into this well in a way that we didn't quite do here. But we're going to do a follow-up video to this examining the links between Christianity and conservatism, which will be out after Thanksgiving, I think. So thank you for watching all the way through. And in the meantime, remember that the only way out of this is to accept Christ. Everything else will just be trying to slow down the spread of evil.
You are the scum of the earth. Well, technically, you're the calcium, lime, and rust of the earth. But the way you gunk up the very...
If you've spent more than 5 minutes operating in the realm of American politics, and in particular right-wing American politics, then you've probably heard something to the effect of, America was built upon Christian values. Christian values are what made America great, what made America exceptional. And this is true. But because we're lazy and we enjoy the temporary perceived comforts of a secular society, we also think that this country was built upon religious freedom or something, which isn't true. That's, of course, what they tell you in public school to justify the promotion of the religions of the state, Satanism, atheism, progressivism, etc. Just like, in the latter half of the 20th century, they use these ideas of free speech and free expression, to promote communism and degeneracy throughout the culture. Why would you ever take these people at their word? But yeah, so they tell you that the founding fathers were refugees fleeing religious persecution, just like the Muslims are now. Yeah, well, that would be like saying people who wanted to go to Five Guys instead of In-N-Out were seeking dietary freedom. They're still eating burgers, bro. Virtually every European American identified as a Christian in 1776, except for a couple thousand Jews, bro. When they say that the Constitution was written for a religious people and that it wouldn't function with any other population, they were talking about Christians, bro. It never would have occurred to them that they'd be dealing with all this other nonsense in their country, bro. But we fumbled for a century or so, and so now we have to figure this out. Oh, but the First Amendment says that freedom of religion and separation of church and state. No, it doesn't actually. First of all, separation of church and state is not a real
When they said separation from church and state, they meant separation from the state to the church. Like, the state can't control the church. They didn't mean that you can't use
thing that's not written anywhere in any of the founding documents of this country. That is in reference to a letter that Thomas Jefferson penned in the early 1800s, but that's about it. Secondly, properly understood in terms of how our country was established, it is a separation of church from state, which means that the intent was to prevent the state from interfering with the practice of religion, specifically Christianity, which is why the First Amendment says that Congress can't establish a religion.
Exactly what I was
This is not exactly
saying.
a fresh take, but what's the significant difference between what Congress and the federal government have done and what an official established religion would do? They have their holidays, they have their saints, their martyrs, they have their myths, their narratives, they have their rituals and sacrifices, they have their slogans, prayers, even, like, it's all there. And truly, I don't mean to come off as disrespectful to the non-Christians in the audience, but this is also clear to me now that I think it would actually be more disrespectful to you if I were to try to dress it up or sugarcoat it. So, at the very least, I'm honest, if perhaps...
Yeah, no, it would be more disrespectful because as a Christian, you want everyone to become... Oh, bro, I have the same... I just realized this. I have the same... I have the exact same bobblehead as him. That's funny.
off-putting, and there's a couple quotes that I think work well here. I can't remember to whom exactly they're attributed, but the first one is, those who think religion and politics aren't linked understand neither. And this is true, and we'll explain why as we continue, but I want you to think about that as well as this one, which you can probably relate to as someone who knows about politics, who understands what's going on, where we're headed, and you talk to your friends and family who just don't get it, and you feel like you're going crazy, right? Like, you almost just want to shake them, like, why don't you get it? Listen to me, damn it! Like, they just won't wake up. Well, it's the same thing with Christianity. It's that old saying, don't ever discuss religion and politics. It's impolite. It's like, what else would you talk about? Like, once you get it, once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you can't help but talk about it because everything else just seems like a distraction. And such is, of course, the nature of knowing the truth, going down the rabbit hole. Like, you can never see things the same way. And lots of people would prefer to live in a state of, like, blissful ignorance, which is understandable, but no one can honestly return to that state once they see the truth. And so in the last video, we discussed the links between liberalism and Satanism, and this is actually technically part 4 of this series, the final part, because we had 2 prerequisite videos that explain concepts that we built off in other videos, and so I'll put links to all of the other videos in the series in the description, plus a little video called How We Let the 2010s Change Politics Forever, which explains the contrast between Christian morality and what is being promoted throughout society by the left. But in this video, we're going to cover so many important things, and so please watch all the way through, even if you disagree, so at least it can be a fair disagreement, but I think that you'll be with me on at least a few of these points, even if you disagree with the thesis of this video, which I guess I'll say now is that if there is to be conservatism, meaning the conservation of the traditional American society, then there has to be Christianity. They are inextricably linked. You cannot have America without conservatism, and you cannot have conservatism without Christianity simply because America was built by Christianity. If you try to run this system without Christianity, you are setting yourself up for failure. And so now we will explain why Christian philosophy is the opposite of leftist philosophy, and why they'll always be at odds with each other, why the Constitution seemingly failed, why the Second Amendment seemingly failed, the truth about liberal Christianity, how liberal democracy hides its tyranny and maintains its power, how religion is inevitable, how the immaterial was transformed into the material to allow for evil, why Christian virtue is absolutely necessary for young men to successfully take their country back, how we're all going to die, how to prepare for that part, including the part where I give you a free book if you want it. So this is also important, so do stay tuned.
John Doyle in Heck Off Commie.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Heck Off Commie. I hope you all had a fantastic Thanksgiving, and we are now going to get into some very important topics that I think will answer a lot of questions that we've all had in the backs of our minds, but that we didn't really think to ask or quite know how to articulate, especially in terms of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. Because as I've gotten older and I've thought about things more, it's been very difficult for me to buy into this conservative tendency to sort of, idolize the Constitution and the Second Amendment. Oh, well, the problem is we just didn't listen to the Constitution. Well, the Second Amendment is the only reason we'll never have a tyrannical government. Like, I promise you that you can't provide to me an objection that I haven't already thought of, and I would urge you instead to consider how honestly you can still say these things after the last 2 or so years of the American experience. And when we talk momentarily about the actual nature nature of how our government maintains power and the Constitution and the Second Amendment, I think that you'll find that discussion to be much more satisfying than the same tired excuses that we've heard from the bumper sticker crowd. But anyways, given that this country was built by Christian men, to which of course the objection is always going to be, well, this guy had an affair. Well, this guy did a bad thing. Yeah, but he probably repented for it and at least acknowledged that it was wrong. Whereas your faction seeks to usher in evil through the abandonment of the immaterial by publishing articles saying, well, science says there's nothing wrong with casual sex. Well, science says morality is subjective. We're going to dissect this a little bit later, but in summary, you're stupid. The point being that this country was built by men who were virtually all Christian with a handful of exceptions, if that. And because of this, Christianity was the dominant religion and had the primary impact on the ethics, the culture, and the politics of this nation. And this calls back to the quote from earlier, that those who think that religion and politics aren't linked understand neither. And this is true because what religion is, by definition, is an understanding of how things are. And what politics is, by definition, is an understanding of how things ought to be. And if you understand how things are, then you necessarily understand how things ought to be because your understanding of how things are informs that. This is why anyone who claims to be a Christian and who says things like, well, I don't let my religion inform my political beliefs is misguided because what they're basically doing is masturbating to this idea of the comfortable, unbiased, secular society and their allegiance to that, above their allegiance to their literal creator, which is a form of pride, which of course is a sin. They refuse to sacrifice their public perception by taking the unpopular but still correct approach by acknowledging that religious beliefs and political beliefs are necessarily intertwined. And they instead opt to maintain this farce of impartiality because they think it makes them appear smarter, more educated, more just, more balanced, or whatever. My case was somewhat unique. My politics actually came first, and then I realized that Christianity was identical to my moral compass, and then I read in the Bible that God inscribes morality onto all of our hearts, and I was like, oh, that's how that happened. Like, I always just strongly detested degenerate behavior, just instinctively. I am instinctively based because my parents never really sat me down and said, you know, don't do this, don't do that. The schools kind of just stood back while these things were happening, or they enabled them indirectly. It was always just a very strong instinct that I had that I could not explain before I read the Bible. And something else to keep in mind is that the left does not separate their politics and their religion. Like their religion, though maybe not as official as Christianity, 100% informs their politics, and it always will. So what's the religion of the left, so to speak? Even the people on the left who claim to be Christians would actually find themselves more closely aligned with this than with a proper understanding of Christianity. And this, broadly speaking, is something called humanism, which is the idea that man has supreme authority rather than nature or God. And the progression of mankind is the ultimate purpose of all human action. And this is important because the political manifestation of humanism is simply socialism, because humanism, as a rejection of nature and an elevation of man, seeks to eliminate any form of inequality between people. So think about it this way. God created human beings and God created nature. God is at the top of the hierarchy above human beings, and the nature which God created has certain people better at certain things, man different from woman, etc. Therefore, Christianity and the worship of God, conservatism, true meritocracy, true freedom, order, masculinity, these are all things that are right-wing. All of these things are related, they are all intertwined, and they are all necessary for the societal propagation of each other. And the opposites would be things like atheism, Satanism, socialism, communism, this concept of equality, equity, chaos, femininity or androgyny, equality of outcome. These are all things that are left-wing, and they're all intertwined, and they're all reliant upon each other for their respective societal propagation. And what I'm going to try to articulate today is that all of the adjacent things on both the right and the left are ultimately dependent upon one thing, the most important thing, which is simply the presence or the absence of God, or I should say the worship of God or the worship of the self. This is why Christian philosophy is the opposite of leftist philosophy. Think about it. Conservatism. Conserving a society that was safe, free, moral, and prosperous, that had God's blessing, that was one nation under God, whose framework of government was designed to operate only for a religious, hear that as Christian population. That is so obviously and unambiguously indicative of the necessity of Christianity. Whereas the rejection, the opposite, the rejection of masculinity and femininity, the rejection of hierarchy, of nature, etc., all of that is only possible with the rejection of God. That's why we lose. We don't even believe in what we're talking about anymore. We have a God-sized hole in this country. We talk about Christianity, we talk about Christian values, but nobody wants to have faith anymore. No one wants to believe what they're saying. If there is to be conservatism, there has to be Christianity. The society that you're trying to conserve was that way because of Christianity. You don't even necessarily have to believe all the time. Many don't. That's what faith is. It is choosing to believe, not just acknowledging that the bridge exists, but choosing to trust it by walking across it. Not every Christian feels the presence of God at all times. And most Christians find themselves questioning their faith from time to time. But what's important is the choice. That is what faith is. But we don't have faith, and so we lose. Look at how the left takes to the streets, how they scream, how their entire lives are dedicated to the religions of the state. That energy is very real. It's nothing to be pointed and laughed at. And it's being driven by evil forces. And this calls back to John Milton's depiction of Satan that we discussed in the last video, because Milton Satan believed that it was better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And fundamentally, the leftist is a person who wholeheartedly believes that it is better to reign in hell, whereas right-wing people tend to believe that it would be better to serve in heaven. Once again, this is the rejection versus the acknowledgement of hierarchy. And because the left fundamentally rejects all hierarchies, because they are prideful and because they are narcissistic and each wants to be the rulers of their own hell, that is exactly what they create with their efforts and their energies. Think about it. Jordan Peterson used to say this, that you can often infer someone's intentions by observing the outcomes of their actions. Everything the left touches becomes ugly, it becomes backwards, it becomes perverted, it becomes unnatural, it becomes wrong. This is the closest thing that we could imagine to hell on earth, a place where everyone is the ruler, because no one or no thing is the ruler. Nothing is beautiful, nothing is good, because everything is relative, and resultantly, everything is actually terrible. And now we live in chaos and despair. And whether it's racial issues, sexual issues, economic issues, it doesn't matter. The left will always possess that same metaphysical impulse, that same satanic impulse which says, I don't want anyone above me, and I will bring about hell on earth in order to get my desires. Now, contrast that with the metaphysical impulse of the right. We, sure, reject the satanic impulse of the left, but we also don't exactly embrace the knightly impulse of Christianity that we are called to embrace, which actually enables evil to propagate through our inaction. So what are we even doing? We don't act because we don't actually believe in anything. The same way that the leftist believes in himself above everything else, the conservative does not believe in himself at all. But this is not because he necessarily believes in something greater than himself, which could compel him to strive towards it maybe in the past, but rather because he doesn't even believe in himself enough to trust that he could even know what that is anymore. He has become conditioned into the secular framework, and he's been very comfortable there for quite some time. But as he relaxed under that illusion of maintaining moral neutrality throughout society, maintaining the power vacuum throughout society, some very dark and ancient things, which were only suppressed by proactive, godly, and knightly moralism, they're creeping back into society, just like they have many times throughout the history of the world. And our sense of false comfort has left us quite unprepared for what is currently happening, and definitely for what's going to happen next. But of course, before we get into what's going to happen next, hear me out on this, because men are being inundated with overpriced boxers designed for testosterone-deficient men. This is not a joke. This is not even a sales pitch. If you are wearing underwear from these mainstream brands that use polyester, you are literally lowering your testosterone because chemicals are absorbing into your balls through this fabric. Again, this is a fact. You have to keep in mind, all of our sponsors are huge fans of the content, which is why we get away with saying whatever we want, but also why we're not trying to sell you like, obscure supplements or insurance policies or whatever. The point being, Undertac is epic. It's where I got the boxers I'm wearing right now. It's where I got this t-shirt with St. Michael the Archangel on it, except he's got an AR-15 this time. Sword of St. Michael, AR-15 of St. Michael. They're all getting thirstier by the day, and our tremendous and wonderful God will give them an ocean of blood to drink upon his return.
They want? They
Anyways,
just wanted
you know the
me
drill.
to give
They're
them
durable,
a
they're
gift.
comfortable. There's a secret tactical pocket in the back. They're antibacterial, anti-pilling, anti-communist, anti-shrink. They're lightweight, breathable, also important. Plus, they're 30% less expensive than the competition. So go to Undertac or getundertac.com. That's getundertac.com right now as a special introductory offer. Buy 3 get 1 free with the offer code
why
DOIL.
is
That's 4
everyone
pairs for the same
asking
price as 2 from the competition? Satisfaction guaranteed or your money back.
for
This
a
man is your
gift?
friend. He fights for the comfort of your private parts. Getundertac.com. Offer code DOIL. Very epic. We continue. So the last thing I want to talk about before getting into the stuff that I think is the most interesting is that you cannot be a Christian and be a liberal. And whenever you do any sort of gatekeeping like this, people get defensive. They start melting down like, well, you think just because someone doesn't agree with your definition, well, they can't be this thing, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, because it's not my definition. It's the definition. It's not like it's some club or something. We're not telling you can't sit at the lunch table. It's a very calm and rational explanation. Like, oh, well, yeah, if you believe this, then by definition, you are not this. It's really that simple. And of course, we must remember, and you can take this to the bank, endorsed by the CEO of conservative gatekeeping, that the only people who get upset about gatekeeping are the people who the gate was supposed to keep out in the first place. But anyways, there are 3 reasons that you cannot be both a liberal and a Christian. Those reasons, starting from the top of the pyramid and trickling down, are the ethos of liberalized Christianity, the theory of liberalism, and the implications of both in practice. And the most obvious of the 3 is what this looks like in practice, and we go into this in much greater detail in those other videos that I mentioned, but you cannot operate within the left-wing coalition that is promoting everything that is the most antithetical to Christianity in our society and still call yourself a Christian. You just can't. The mental gymnastics are too advanced. It really is that simple. So why do they ignore this? Well, that gets into the ethos of it, but before that, the second reason, what liberalism is in theory. It is a prioritization of the self above all outside constraints. This is inherently antithetical to Christianity, which makes objective declarations about morality, about nature, about God, etc. And it is, of course, liberalism in theory, which leads to what we see in practice from the global left, which we correctly identified in the last video as the greatest political force for Satanism in the history of the world, because there's virtually no difference between the doctrines of liberalism and the doctrines of Satanism. Again, as we proved in the previous video, so watch that if you need the explanation. But finally, the top of the pyramid, which enables these mental gymnastics, which allows for these so-called Christian liberals to keep doing this, it is the ethos of liberalized Christianity. True Christianity, which you tend to see from conservatives who are Christian, is focused on sacrifice, on serving God, etc. But liberalized Christianity is focused almost exclusively on this idea of tolerance, on loving thy neighbor, on accepting people. Oh, Jesus would have been a socialist, this whole train of thought. And this is why they can ignore the fact that their coalition promotes child sacrifice, promotes the total inversion of sexual behavior. All of this nonsense because their entire sense of being is simply making excuses for other people's behavior and absolutely refusing to condemn evil at risk of being intolerant. This is what liberalism is. We're all the same, and if someone does something not as well as someone else, or they break the law, well, it's because of environmental factors. It's because of socioeconomic factors. Literally, their entire framework of thought is pathologically making excuses for individual behavior, and what liberal Christians are doing by this is they are contesting God, because by absolutely refusing to condemn evil, to hold people accountable, to instead just focus on love and acceptance, they are implying through this that they are more merciful than God, which is very dangerous stuff, because God will hold these people accountable eventually. And 1 John says that you are not to try to be more merciful than God, but that is what the entirety of liberalized Christianity is. That's the ethos of it. It is prideful, it is heretical, it is satanic. You cannot be a liberal and be a Christian.
No.
If you're a liberal, you are acting against God's will, and you are claiming to do the opposite by dressing your sin up in the name of Christ, and that is not going to fare well for you. Hey, cut it out. Knock it off. You're being dumb. But we continue. Ow.
You don't know what you're supposed to do, and somehow it all just comes together. And then you don't know why you wouldn't have known.
To get into why our country devolved to this point and how that's related to God, we first have to understand how our country works, how the system works, and how our country operates under the system of a liberal democracy. Well, we're a constitutional republic, right? That's a form of liberal democracy. Now, the problem with this is actually even revealed in the name itself, since liberalism is dumb and democracy is cringe. So combining the two would, of course, create something via the transitive property that is dumb and cringe. So there's that. But liberal democracy was something of an experiment at the time, so I'm less concerned with debating the theory of it, more concerned with what it does in practice, how its weaknesses are exploited to the detriment of the American people, etc. And liberal democracy is very, very good at maintaining its power and hiding its tyranny. And it does this by selectively applying both implicit and explicit force. And the importance of the former cannot be overstated. I've had this argument with my dad for hours before over the phone. It's just so important to understand how our system operates and why we're never going to liberate ourselves from it by using the tools that they provided to us, which are provided to us to justify the existence of the system. So the first thing to understand is that 99% of the political education that you have was given to you to justify the nature and the existence of the regime. Even if you think you have a piece of information that challenges the regime, chances are that if you got it from a public school or from a mainstream book or even one of the edgy and controversial ones that they don't want you to read, like 1984, Fahrenheit 451, etc., chances are that all of that education was designed to justify the nature of the regime. And there are 2 examples of this in particular that I want to highlight here. And those are things like martial law, confiscation of firearms, etc., and then censorship, state-run media, etc. And since the regime ultimately serves the interests of the left, whether that's because they occupy it directly or because people without agency and the capacity for penetrating thought are predisposed to comply with the narratives of the regime, the unwashed masses, so to speak. But in terms of how it's justified to people on the right, it goes something like this. Sure, right-wing people might dislike the incumbent class of politicians or whatever, but the solution will always be to just vote in good guys to basically try to work within the system. And I've sort of advocated for this before. I stand by that, but My cool friends and I would be making serious changes to the way the system works. But my point is that right-wing people don't often think about just how much they've lost and how they've lost it all while they were still winning elections and holding office. They just kind of have this general faith in the system because while it might not be perfect, it safeguards from tyranny, the worst possible thing in the world, with the Constitution. And if everyone would just listen to the Constitution, then everything would be fine. This is because right-wing individuals tend to have a concept of tyranny that was taught to them in public schools and by Hollywood. Tyranny is when there's a dictator and when you can't buy things that you want and when you can't own guns and when the government censors any speech that criticizes it. And the only reason we're not there yet is because of our Second Amendment and that America has about 400 million guns. So as long as we have guns, tyranny won't come to America. And if it did, we'd take care of it. And as long as we don't have the state controlling media, we can still access information. And if private media companies act in ways that I disagree with, that's okay because they're private companies. This is the brilliance of the tyranny of liberal democracy because we are living under one of the greatest tyrannies that the world has ever seen. And people don't recognize it because it isn't in their face. It isn't necessarily the dictator or the door-to-door confiscations that we were taught about. No, it's not as obvious. This is because liberal democracy teaches its subjects that dangerous power is always concentrated. But liberal democracy avoids that because we have the three branches of government, checks and balances. We have private media companies. We have private companies. We vote for all of these things, whether that's with our dollars or with our ballots. And because we have therefore consented to these things, they are just. And this is the key distinction. We are not dealing with concentrated power. This sort of like Saturday morning cartoon concept of one guy and all his henchmen wielding power over us. That's not it. We are dealing with ideological power, which is cumulatively wielded throughout society. It is not concentrated, and it doesn't have to be. It can be compartmentalized, and people will feel. They will feel okay about this because they confuse compartmentalization with deconcentration. But that's not what it is. You can have 10,000 troops spread out a little bit more. But if they're all under the same flag and there's no opposition, you're screwed. And that's our problem right now. We don't have privatized power competing with state power. We don't have within the state the Congress competing with the executive branch. None of it is competing. Every relevant institution in this country that has power is wielding it under the same flag. They're wearing the same uniform. It is ideological power, and it is being wielded against you. And they are allowed to do this because it is not as obvious as arresting you or executing you. That's what dictators do, and you don't live under a dictator. But the effects are basically the same. On paper, it's all the same. If you go against the narratives of the regime, you're not going to be like disappeared or something, but you will be kicked out from the public square. Your family and friends will hate you. You'll lose your job. State-adjacent paramilitary forces will attack you, and nothing will be done about it. You'll be kicked out of school. You won't be able to open up a bank account or take out a loan. For all intents and purposes, it is the same. But we think that it isn't because of a very little and insignificant difference. Instead of the state operating under a dictator controlling all of these things in society and punishing you if you don't comply, it is now the state and all of these private companies and institutions operating under the exactly same ideology, doing the exactly same thing to you. And this is because it was never about the dictator. It was always about the ideology. It was always about the narrative. You're taught in public school that these crazy people just all of a sudden woke up and were dictators, and there were these crazy things, and they just wanted to do it and have power over people for no reason. They were mean, and you were taught that so that when the same tyranny occurs to you in your country, you don't notice it because there's not one guy to point out and go, hey, he's a dictator, isn't he? It's not about the dictator. It's about the narrative he represents. Our system removes the tyrant, but still crams the narrative down your throat every second that you are awake, no matter where you go. And this is the biggest problem of the Enlightenment. The biggest flaw is the democratic part, the part where we assume that the individual is actually capable of being a free thinker. That is absurd and so demonstrably untrue. 95% of people will believe what they are told for their entire lives without questioning a word of it because they don't care. They don't actually care about thinking critically. And most of them don't even have the biological infrastructure necessary to do so in the first place. Like, as long as the masses can wake up and have reasonable access to food, sex, and entertainment, they will not question anything. There is a reason that the profile of the average American is an overweight, porn-addicted Netflix subscriber. You just give the masses just enough to distract and sedate them, because otherwise they realize the state of their condition. Maybe they start asking questions. Maybe they start asking why they can't afford a home, why they can't start a family, why they were coerced into becoming a debt slave, why they just witnessed the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. All of these questions. Maybe they start to feel a bit sad, and they talk to someone in the field of psychology, which operates under the flag of the ruling ideology. And psychology says, yeah, you just have a chemical imbalance. This is perfectly natural. Rates of prescription drug use, suicide, and depression have always been this high, actually, but people just didn't talk about it back then because of open textbooks, social constructs, or whatever. Here, take these feel normal pills. Then you become a zombie who feels nothing, as opposed to something bad, which might compel you to realize how completely backwards and terrible everything is. But here's something you have to realize. They do not need to control the guns if they control the information, if they control what's inside of you, what's in your head. They don't need to take the guns. They will let terrorists come to your house and kill you. And if you defend yourself, then you will be prosecuted. Let's be honest, though, they're not even going to cover it or even care if the mob gets to you before you can load in another PMAG. So you'll either be dead or in jail. Or best case scenario, you will have legal debt that takes you your entire life to pay off, but no one will hire you to earn money to pay that debt off because they're afraid of acting against the narratives too. They don't need to take the guns because they know that the guns are your token of freedom. They're a prop. As long as the American people have their guns, they will believe that they are free. So it's a much better strategy to just wait for them to have to use them to defend themselves from the consequences of the regime narratives, and then just send them to jail, draw them in legal debt. Don't take them. If you try to take them, then that risks people realizing just how bad things really are. The other thing that the state doesn't have to do is suppress media. The state operating under an ideology doesn't have to suppress the media because the media companies operating under the same ideology will do it for them because they're all on the same team, and that team is against you. And very recently, the right has actually started to realize that censorship by communists is bad, regardless of whether it's the private companies or the state doing it. But we had to cut through a lot of, well, it's a private company, start your own web browser, all that nonsense from the smug narrative servants in the process. So the question becomes, when are we going to realize that implicit power is just as bad as explicit power? Actually, it's worse because it hides in the shadows. It's less obvious. It's harder to detect. When are we going to realize this? I don't think we will until the whole thing collapses, to be honest. But let me explain what I mean by that. But first, you knew this was coming. Did someone say collapse? It's time to start your Christmas shopping. The first item on your list needs to be iTarget Pro. This revolutionary system allows you to dry fire practice with your actual firearm one day. That's the letter iTargetPro.com. iTargetPro.com. Offer code Doyle. Very epic, but we continue. We were just talking about examples of implicit power versus explicit power, whether we were ever going to realize that they're both bad for us. And I want to talk about a concept that was introduced by Machiavelli regarding two types of political operatives, which he described as lions and foxes. So put into almost criminally basic terms, the lion uses strength to achieve ends, while the fox uses cunning to achieve ends. These are not unfailingly without overlap in terms of individual actors, but I'm going to be speaking about these within the modern context in a way that is also congruent with the understanding of right-wing and left-wing people that you're familiar with if you watch the show. So in the modern context, the lion is the conservative. He values God, tradition, order, his nation, etc., but he hasn't used his strength because he doesn't understand the threat that he's being faced with yet. And he doesn't understand how much power he's lost to the foxes. But an important distinction to be made between the two in the modern context is that the lion isn't necessarily not cunning because he doesn't know how to be, but more often because he purposefully elects not to be cunning because he assumes that his enemies are not actually his enemies and or that they are acting in good faith, or that to be cunning is to sacrifice sacred principles, etc. That's the lion. The fox in the modern context is the left-wing individual. They don't value tradition or God or nation. They value progress. They value tolerance and being nice, etc. But they're different from the lion because their use of cunning is not necessarily out of choice, but rather necessity. Because foxes and liberals tend to be weaker, more feminine, more insecure, more mentally ill. It's so true. All those things. They are intimidated by strength and competition because they cannot contend with it. So instead, they use deception. They use manipulation. That's how they achieve their ends. They manipulate information. The lions, they're outdated. They're out of touch. We know better now. We don't need those things anymore. That's the only way that you can reduce or handicap the lions. You eliminate all of the things that they would be inclined to defend. You remove from the mainstream conversation any concept of God, of nation, of family, of heritage, of culture, all of it, because the lion cannot act if he feels as though he has nothing to defend. So the foxes gain and maintain their power through cunning and guile. They manipulate narrative, they manipulate the truth, all to convince you through brainwashing that this system is good. It should exist, and our people are the ones who should be running it, whereas the lions would just take power regardless. So the fox teaches you in public education that the dictators of days past, well, they were lions who used force, and they do this to you so that you don't detect the ways in which they have power over you now, because they control your mind, and therefore they control your reality, and if not yours, then those of the masses, which makes no difference since the masses vote based off how the regime defines reality, which justifies the existence and the actions of the regime, all of which end up affecting your immediate reality, regardless of whether you can think and operate for yourself, because you still live in that society and therefore under that system. Now, that being said, given that the fox's power tends to be implicit, it's less obvious than explicit power, it also tends to be less immediately secure because foxes themselves tend to be insecure, which means that they're always going to be seeking forms of additional soft power to wield over the population, whether that's regime narratives being introduced into advertising or popular culture, or even something as symbolic as participating in a mass ritual, anything to let them know that you're in compliance and to let you know that, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what's happening. It's in your face. You're not escaping it anytime soon. These are things like demoralization tactics, humiliation rituals, etc., all designed to remind you through soft power that you are subject to the ideological tyranny of the regime, which is just as imposing in your day-to-day life, and actually even more so in many cases than the definition of tyranny that they taught you to be afraid of in public school. But the problem with this is that what the narrative says is happening does not often match reality, and so the narrative is always adjusting and having to explain itself. And it's allowed to do that because the masses are stupid and they lack agency. That's why we point and laugh when we see these people saying things, in January 2020, and then in 2021, the next year, January, they're saying the completely opposite thing. And it's like, yeah, it's funny, but that's not the takeaway. The takeaway is that they literally cannot understand the difference, and we have to understand that. It's not that they're hypocrites, it's that they're lemmings, they're sheep. And you're going to have to figure out how to work within that reality before it's too late, frankly. But yeah, so as the narratives get more and more complex, they naturally start to lose contact with reality and everything becomes so cloudy and confusing. So then they start compensating for that by assuring you that all of this nonsense, which goes against your instincts and better judgment, it's all being promoted by the experts in science, etc. But ultimately, what's going to happen is they will lose contact with the reality of what it takes to maintain power, whether that's domestically or on the global scale, because they get too caught up in their own nonsense. And remember, all of the education that you received from the state is a part of that narrative, and it's all self-justifying. Even this idea of, oh, well, knowledge is power. No, it's not. What does that even mean? That's what you hear in school, but it's not true. Your knowledge of the vocab terms of the regime narratives is not power. But them forcing you to know those vocab terms in order to participate in society, that's power. Oh, well, there's not total media censorship like under real tyranny. It doesn't matter. There doesn't have to be. And they know that. You personally can access information and do your own research because you're smart. You think for yourself. But the masses don't. They aren't capable of doing that. But guess what? Their vote counts just as much as yours does. And it's those votes that justify all of the changes in society that do and will affect you directly. It is literally the equivalent of you going into a classroom as an adult and the teacher says, okay, kids, put up your hands to vote. We can either eat celery sticks or goldfish. But remember, the goldfish are poison. And you're like, this is ridiculous. Goldfish are not poison. They are the snack that smiles back. I can't believe she thinks we would buy into, oh, they're putting their hands up. They're putting their hands up for celery sticks. And guess what you're eating? Celery sticks. That's not even true. Like, there's much worse stuff going on in classrooms. Like, that's actually significantly more believable than what kids are being taught now. But still, the lion loses power to the foxes reduce and handicap the lions, then they use implicit force to maintain their power in society. And this is how a liberal democracy functions, and it's not sustainable, and collapse is inevitable. And you can actually map out this trend pretty clearly following World War II. Remember, we talked about this earlier in the series, and now it's all coming together because you've got the post-World War II intellectual trends that sought to strip man of any sense of identity or understanding of the truth, which might compel him to fight for something. Then you weaken him by destroying masculinity, subsidizing poisonous food, poisoning the water supply, etc., etc. Now you've got all the men who would be lions feeling as though they have nothing to defend and no physical means of doing so, even if they did. And then the foxes rise to power. Slowly, the regime narratives drift further from reality. The regime destabilizes. Total collapse, unavoidable. We've talked about this before, but there is no such thing as a coalition of people who are this unstable, this degenerate, this removed from reality, this godless, and this prideful who have ever been or could ever be successful in the long run. Like, total collapse is unavoidable, and you just have to make sure that you're out of the blast radius. But you need God for that. You need to turn to God, and you need to put your faith in him. And maybe if a country would have been better at that earlier, then we wouldn't have gotten to this point in the first place. You don't believe me? Okay, think about it. How did we get to this point? How did this happen? Why didn't the Second Amendment prevent this? Why didn't the whole Constitution prevent this? How can you still honestly put your faith into those concepts, having had the last 2 years of the American experience affect you? Look at what God-given rights look like in a country that has abandoned God. 100 million gun owners and 400 million guns during the Great greatest tyranny in the history of our country, the history of this continent, and no one did a damn thing about it. Your business had to collapse. You had to miss your father's funeral. You had to stay inside and watch America's greatest cities burn to the ground by the actions of anti-American terrorists, and then watch nothing be done about it because the state was too busy going after people who tried to defend themselves during it, or maybe even going after parents at school board meetings. But still, there's a story in recent history, relatively speaking, about a group of men with horses and black powder rifles who fought off the most powerful and sophisticated military in the history of the world because they believed in God. Well, what does that have to do with it? Everything. It has everything to do with it. Maybe you're ready to go take these people on right now without God, but that's not enough. It is about the soul of the nation. By the way, this is not a call to arms, not a call for violence. I disavow all of that. I am simply analyzing a cope. I am so tired of hearing about the Second Amendment when I know for a fact that we're living under tyranny right now, and we have been for a while, and it's only going to get worse from here. And the same people who are too lazy to go to church or even go door knocking for an authentically right-wing congressional candidate want to just sit back and fantasize about some scenario where they fight off the government. One, they're never going to establish an explicit tyranny because they don't need to in order to control you, like we just talked about, right? We just talked about this. And two, even if they did, you would do nothing about it. And that's because nobody believes in anything anymore. If you do not know God, then you fear death. Everybody's an atheist until the plane starts to go down. You fear accepting the reality of your own impermanence. You fear what happens after you die, and so you cling to life, and you will do anything. You will put up with anything to remain in a state of comfort. You can't possibly invest your life, in the very literal sense, into your country if you believe that it's all you've got, that there's nothing afterwards, that you're not a part of something greater than yourself, especially when that society has made it difficult for you to find a wife and to start a family. Like, who would you even be fighting for? What is there even to fight for? Nobody believes in anything. It is not enough to be well armed. We're not even well armed. We are the most armed. It is actually like stupid how many guns we have, like in a good way, but still, like, it's not enough. I would be more afraid of a population with sticks who still have spirit than I would be of a population of men with the most sophisticated firearms on the market, but who don't have spirit. Want to see a recent example? Look at what happened in Afghanistan. Those men simply retreated into the mountains. They waited, and when their time came, they dusted off the old Soviet mass-produced AKs, and they took their country back from an illegitimate regime with access to the best weaponry and resources in the world. And they did it practically overnight. Why? Because they believed in a God, a false God, but still, it's about the spirit of the nation. Just like we talked about in the last video. You are either living for God or you are living for yourself. And no man who is living for himself is ever going to sacrifice a decadent and superfluously comfortable lifestyle under this system to fight for good and against evil. And again, not calling for violence. If you think that's what I'm doing, you are being dishonest. What I am saying is actually more important than that, because it gets to the root of all of our problems, because we have abandoned the immaterial for the material, and we call this progress. We are standing on the shoulders of giants, and we think that we are flying. The Constitution can only function for a religious people. This is not vague. I say again, the Constitution can only function for a religious people. A religious people are not a people who have abandoned God and the immaterial. I am now going to explain why the Constitution can only function for a religious people, but if you are a conservative, you seek to conserve the traditional American society, which was rooted in Christianity. You seek to conserve the Constitution as the framework from which our country embarks, which the framers wrote could only function for a religious, Christian people. And then you watch the video that we just did proving that the global left is the political force of Satanism, and it's like, how can you not be a Christian? How can you not? I'm now the guy that I used to roll my eyes at, but it's so obvious. Once you see it, it cannot be unseen. Give it a try. Tell me I'm wrong. I will literally give you a Bible. I will literally give you the writings of C.S. Lewis, Chesterton, and I actually mean that. Like, we'll talk about that at the end of the video. But the point is that I would like to get as many of us into heaven as possible. But in the meantime, even if you don't believe in that, Christianity is the only way forward if you actually want to conserve this country. And if you're not into it, you feel weird praying, you feel weird going to church, like that's normal. But it is the only way forward, because you cannot save a nation that has no spirit, that doesn't believe it should exist, that doesn't believe that it's good, and that doesn't believe that fighting for good will be rewarded. But let's talk about the Constitution now. If you know anything about the Constitution, then you probably heard that it was this revolutionary document brilliantly crafted to limit the power of government, to prevent tyranny, and maximize freedom, so long as we follow it diligently. That is the mythos of the Constitution. Like, that's the story surrounding it. And any honest person will concede in regard to the Constitution something to the effect of, yeah, it's not a perfect system. You know, every system's going to have its flaws. Okay, well, then let's acknowledge that. The problem isn't necessarily the Constitution in itself, but rather that we decided to put our faith into a piece of paper rather than God. And let me explain what that means. I forgot who said this. It was someone very smart a very long time ago, but they said that there's no such thing as a nation of laws. That is correct. Like, throughout history, and especially under our current system, whoever is in charge is always going to selectively enforce the written laws. You know, they're going to go after certain people or certain institutions and then forget to go after others. They're going to manipulate semantics to make laws that were written 60 years ago aligned with the current narratives by redefining words, etc., etc. And this is because politics, above all else, is just about doing favors for your friends and punishing your enemies. And I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but 30 years from now, you will thank me. The point being, every law that exists seeks to compel individual behavior, whether that's a speed limit or a law saying that you can't kill people. And like, all of those laws are making some form of moral declaration, even if only in a small capacity. These laws are trying to act as this like sort of algorithm to correct for deviations in human behavior, which are immoral. Now, here's the problem. The left is actually right when they say that the Constitution is just an old piece of paper. It is. But what they want to do is throw it out and replace it with something new, something that reflects their religion. And it is a religion. But at least that acknowledges the immaterial. There's a reason that all of these old societies were obsessed with weird sexual rituals and child sacrifice, because they know that it blurred the lines between our world and demons from which they could extract power. My point is that the Constitution of a society, like literally what constitutes that society, cannot just be a legal document. It cannot just be a piece of paper. Something has to predate and transcend that. There has to be something immaterial from which to draw, from which to be...
That's why they're called God-given rights.
Inspired when writing or founding documents. And our piece of paper has failed because what mattered most and what we failed to take into account is that the men who wrote that document acknowledged the immaterial, that the document was written for a religious people, that we all have God-given rights, but slowly over time, the men who were in charge of enforcing that document became gradually less concerned with the immaterial and more concerned with the material.
If they're God-given rights, you have to accept that there is a God for them to be God-given rights.
and with themselves. And since there is no such thing as a nation of laws, the men who are enforcing that constitution have to be connected to the same immaterial sense that the men who wrote it were, and the people over whom that document and group have authority have to be as well, or else it's not going to work. That's what the word constitution means. It means this document reflects our society, it reflects our people. If everybody in our society is blue, it's going to include that, because that is us. That's who we are. And as our people have abandoned that immaterial sense that formed the constitution of our society, both in terms of population and legal framework, yeah, of course, the document's not going to save us from that. But instead of focusing on bringing people back to that immaterial sense, we just cried, no, look at this piece of paper. It's cool. Believe what it says. No, it's not. Sorry, it's not cool. No one gets that excited looking at the piece of paper. You know what is cool? Banishing Lucifer and his army from heaven because you are just that powerful. Retaking the Holy Land with the fellas. Being so strong in your conviction that you refuse to make a sacrifice to a false god and so you get hacked to death by children. That's cool. Fighting off the British Empire is cool. But all of those things are only possible through the acknowledgement of the divine, of the immaterial, of good, and of all of the things which justify the Constitution. Because without God, the Constitution is literally just a piece of paper. Without God, it is meaningless both in theory and in practice. And how could it not be? How are you supposed to have God-given rights if you don't acknowledge God? And in practice, as we've just covered,
exactly what
you can't sustain the legal constitution if it's contingent upon the demographic constitution being one of faith and of piety. The paper constitution is downstream from the literal constitution of the people, and progressives are right with the whole living document thing, but conservatives lose because they think that all that matters is preserving the document in itself. But they fail to wield the power necessary to preserve the people that would enable the functionality of that document and of that society. Oh, but John, couldn't it function if we just depatriated everyone who disagrees with it? Now you're talking. Now you're talking. But seriously, the true constitution of a society comes from the immaterial. If not God, something else will fill the hole in the hearts of society, because man is a religious animal. There is a God-sized hole in the heart of this country, and something is going to fill it. The legal algorithm to constitute the society can only correct for slight deviations. And if the society by and large rejects it, then it's not going to work. And if the society accepts a new religion, then your old algorithm is already on its way out the door. And that's exactly what's happening to us right now, because religion is inevitable. People want to reject Christianity, or broadly speaking religion, because they think it's outdated. They perceive it to be low class. That's their pride. But if you ask them what they think about existence, they will reveal to you that they're actually very religious. Whether they're spiritual, it's astrology, whatever it is. They all have explanations of how the universe and existence work and why we're here. That's religion. And our government, our institutions, they all claim to be secular, but they're not. No, they have a new religion. And in terms of how it's enforced on society, it's actually no different from like a theocracy, other than it being more subtle. But you look at the way these people take to the streets, the way that they dedicate their lives to these causes. We talked about this earlier, how they derive their meaning and their purpose from them, the way they participate in the rituals, the idol worship, and it's like, yeah, that's religion. But it's a material religion, which is worship of the self, because it worships earthly and material gratification, which of course is Satanism, as we discussed in the last video. Whereas the old religion, the immaterial religion, that implied something greater than us, something immaterial, which would of course be God. And so they simply transformed the immaterial into the material to usher away our beautiful country away from God and towards the devil. The priests are replaced with scientists and psychologists, the experts who tell you how the world really is. This is what's really going on. And the state defines truth fluidly with whatever is in accordance with its ideology and narrative at the time, and it uses these experts to corroborate that, and it censors anything that challenges it. It really is crystal clear. Like, to allow for evil, you have to take attention away from the immaterial and turn it to the material, which is exactly what they've done. But even evil doesn't mean anything anymore. Everything is subjective. Think about it. When people use the word evil nowadays, they're basically just saying like someone that is like really mean. They have no concept of evil that is more sophisticated than like one who is mean, one who does not let others enjoy. And that's because good and evil are spiritual terms. They call back to the immaterial. They acknowledge it. And because of that, they are now regarded as archaic, outdated, low class, backwards, unprogressive. We know better than that now. We have science now. Science says this. Science says that. Science says, look at this study about hormones and synapses and neurochemicals. And it's like, okay, but then you get away from the papers and the lab coats and you look at the results of all of this, and it becomes really, really hard to not recognize child sacrifice when you see it. Like, why do you think it always comes back to your children? Why is that? Whether it's directly or even corrupting them in schools, throughout every aspect of media, why? Your brain has been trained and conditioned to only think of things in terms of the material. And so you're like, well, surely there must be some explanation. What does the science say? There must be a study for this. No. It's simply that they want your kids. That's it. They literally just want your kids. They worship themselves and they hate God. And God hates the shedding of innocent blood. And the destruction of children and their innocence is the ultimate protest against God. And it always has been. These people worship demons. But because, well, I have a study, it must be different from when it was happening thousands of years ago, right? There's nothing more beautiful than a child that is innocence. And because they hate beauty, they seek to destroy that. And so now what's happening is many people, just like us, are starting to think about these things. They can't quite put their finger on it, but they can tell that something is deeply wrong.